Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It's been nearly 30 years since it happened, but I can still feel that fear when I think about it. The kind that makes your whole body go cold. I was only 5 years old when my parents decided to move us to this remote property on Elk Mountain near Centennial, Wyoming. This was back in 1992. My dad had always dreamed of living somewhere away from everything, and when he found this 5-acre former silver mining claim for a price we could actually afford, he jumped on it. We weren't rich by any means. Dad worked construction in Laramie, about a 45-minute drive away, and Mom homeschooled me since we lived so far from town. The cabin we built was pretty basic, just a main room with a small kitchen area, a bathroom, and a sleeping platform they built for me up above. It was basically a loft space that gave me my own little area, with a small window that looked out into the darkness of the forest behind our cabin. The cabin itself backed right up against the mountain slope, which was really steep. If you stood at the back of our property looking at the cabin, my little window was maybe 14 or 15 feet off the ground due to how the mountain rose up behind us. Dad had talked about building a deck back there someday, but never got around to it. That fall was my first on the mountain. I remember being excited about seeing snow, since we'd moved from Arizona, where I'd never really experienced a proper winter. But what happened that night in October changed everything about how I felt about our new home. It was a Wednesday night. I remember because Dad had brought home pizza from town as a midweek treat, and I'd gone to bed with a full stomach and the taste of pepperoni still on my breath. Mom had tucked me in around 8:30, and I had my favorite stuffed animal, a tiger named Stripes, clutched against my chest as I started to drift off. I don't know exactly what time it was when I first heard it. The digital clock by my bed read something like 11:17, which meant I'd been asleep for a while before something woke me up. At first I thought it was just the wind, which often made the pine trees scrape against the cabin roof. But then I heard it again, a hooting sound, but not like an owl. I knew what those sounded like. This was deeper, longer, almost like someone trying to mimic an owl, but not getting it quite right. It echoed slightly across the mountainside, and I remember sitting up in bed, clutching Stripes tighter. I listened for what felt like forever, wondering if I should call out for my parents. They were asleep in their bed on the other side of the cabin. But I didn't want them to think I was being a baby about some night sounds. Then I heard movement outside my window, not like an animal scurrying around, but heavy, deliberate. The sound of branches breaking, leaves and pine needles being crushed underfoot. Something big was moving right outside the cabin, right below my window. I froze. My 5-year-old mind ran through all the possibilities. A bear, a mountain lion, maybe even one of the elk the mountain was named for. Dad had told me about all the wildlife around us when we moved in, explaining that we were in their home now, not the other way around. The footsteps, and they were definitely footsteps, stopped right under my window. I could hear breathing. Deep, heavy breathing, like when Dad would come back from chopping wood, but louder. So much louder. There was a sniffing sound, like something was smelling the air. Then the strangest sensation came over me. This absolute certainty that whatever was out there knew I was inside, that it was there for me. I don't know why, but I turned toward the window. Maybe it was that thing where you just have to look at what scares you. The curtains were open because I like to look at the stars before falling asleep. That's when I saw it. A face was looking in at me. Not pressed against the glass, but definitely there, just a few feet away from the window. It was dark, covered in what looked like black hair, with a flatter nose than a person has. But what I remember most clearly were the eyes. They reflected the dim light from my nightlight, glowing a yellowish-red color that didn't look like any animal eyes I'd ever seen in my books. Those eyes were looking right at me, not just in my direction, at me. There was intelligence there, recognition. This thing was watching me, studying me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It felt like the air had turned to cement in my lungs. The face tilted slightly, as if curious. I could see now that the head was massive, much bigger than my dad's, and there were no ears visible in all that hair. That's when my brain finally caught up with what my eyes were seeing, and I screamed. I screamed so loud my throat hurt instantly. I screamed my parents' names over and over, still staring at that face in the window because I couldn't look away. The creature didn't run at first. It just kept staring for what felt like forever, but was probably only a second or two. Then, as I heard my parents' footsteps rushing across the cabin floor, it moved away from the window. Dad burst into my room first, with Mom right behind him. I was standing on my bed by this point, pointing at the window, trying to explain through hysterical sobs what I'd seen. Dad grabbed me and handed me to Mom, then cautiously approached the window. "There's nothing there now, buddy," he said, but I could hear the tension in his voice. He wasn't dismissing me. "It was looking at me," I managed to choke out. "It had glowing eyes and hair all over." Dad looked out the window for a long moment, then turned back to us. "I'm going to go check outside." Mom protested, but Dad was already heading for the front door, grabbing his shotgun from the closet on the way. I clung to Mom as we heard the front door open and close. The minutes he was outside felt like hours. Mom kept asking me questions about what I'd seen, trying to keep me talking, probably to distract me from my fear. It was big, Mom, bigger than Dad, and it wasn't a bear. It had a face like a person, but not really. When Dad finally came back in, his expression was strange. He locked the door behind him, something he rarely did out there, and checked all the windows before coming back to us. "Didn't see anything out there," he said, but there was something in his voice that told me he wasn't telling the whole truth. "But I'm going to take a better look in the morning, when it's light." They let me sleep in their bed that night. I don't think any of us really slept. I kept hearing noises outside, that same hooting sound, but farther away now, and what sounded like wood knocking against wood. Dad got up several times to look out the windows. When morning finally came, we all went outside together. Dad wouldn't let me or Mom out of his sight. He led us around to the back of the cabin, to the area below my window. What we found there didn't make sense. The ground had been disturbed, branches broken, some ferns trampled. But there weren't clear footprints because of all the pine needles and fallen leaves covering the forest floor. But what struck me most was watching Dad look up at my window, then back at the steep slope behind it. "That window's almost 15 feet up from here," he said quietly, more to himself than to us. "And with the slope like this." He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. For something to look in that window, it would have had to be incredibly tall, 7, maybe 8 feet at minimum. There was no way an average person could have stood there and peered in, not without a ladder, and there was definitely no ladder. Dad spent the rest of the day checking the property, looking for more signs. He didn't find much, just some broken branches higher up on trees than made sense, and what might have been a partial footprint in a muddy patch near the creek that ran along one edge of our property. It was huge, easily twice the size of Dad's boot, but not clear enough to make out toes or anything definitive. That night, Dad nailed my window shut and hung a thicker curtain. He also installed a floodlight on the back of the cabin, pointing it toward the forest. We slept with the shotgun propped against their bedside table for weeks after. I never saw the creature looking in my window again, but I heard those sounds occasionally. That deep hooting, the wood knocks, always at night, always from the deeper forest beyond our property. Sometimes in the morning, we'd find branches arranged in strange patterns near the edge of our clearing, or rocks stacked in ways that didn't seem natural. My parents never dismissed what I saw. They never told me it was just a nightmare or my imagination. In fact, a few months later, I overheard Dad telling one of his work friends about finding 18-inch footprints in the snow one morning, leading up to about 20 yards from our cabin before turning back into the deep woods. We lived in that cabin for 4 more years before Dad got a job offer in Colorado that was too good to pass up. I was secretly relieved when we moved. I never felt completely safe in my sleeping loft again, even with the window nailed shut. I'm 36 now, with kids of my own. We live in the suburbs of Denver, about as far from those Wyoming mountains as you can get, while still seeing them on the horizon. I've researched what I saw over the years, read accounts from others who've had similar experiences. I know what most people would say, that I was a kid with an active imagination, that it was probably just a bear standing on its hind legs. That memory is unreliable. But I know what I saw that night on Elk Mountain. I can still see those intelligent eyes staring back at me, still feel that primal recognition that I was in the presence of something that shouldn't exist but does. Something that was just as curious about me as I was terrified of it. I don't tell many people this story. It sounds crazy, I know, but sometimes when I take my family camping in the mountains, I find myself listening for that distinctive hooting sound in the darkness beyond our campfire. And I always make sure our tent is zipped tight, with no gaps where something might peer in, because whatever watched me through my window that night is still out there, and I'm not the only one who's seen it. Story 2. I've been hesitating to post this for years. I know how it sounds. Truth is, I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't lived it. This happened in October 2017, and I still get chills thinking about it. I live outside North Conway, New Hampshire. Beautiful area, especially in fall when the leaves change, but there's a lot of wilderness out here. That night, I was coming back from a friend's place after watching the Patriots game. It was around 1 in the morning, and I was taking this old dirt road that cuts through former logging land. It's a shortcut I'd used hundreds of times before. Saves about 15 minutes compared to the main road. It was a clear night, cold as hell though, the kind where your breath fogs up even inside the car. My heater was acting up, so I had on my winter jacket, beanie, the works. The road is pretty rough in spots, all washboards and potholes, so I was only doing maybe 25 miles per hour, just cruising along. I remember the radio was on low, some classic rock station that was mostly static out there in the sticks. No moon that night, pitch black except for my headlights cutting through the trees. The forest gets dense on both sides of that road, pines mostly, with some old maples and oaks mixed in. I was about 7 miles from home when I came around this bend in the road. My headlights swept across something that made me slam on the brakes so hard my tires skidded on the dirt. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. There was this thing crossing the road maybe 30 feet ahead of me. It was massive. I mean, fucking huge. Standing upright like a person, but as wide as a bear, maybe wider. It froze when my lights hit it, and for a second we just stared at each other. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was covered in this coarse black hair, like 2 or 3 inches long, but its chest and face had less hair, showing grayish skin underneath. Its face, God, I'll never forget that face. It wasn't like an animal exactly. It had this flat face with a wide nose and these deep-set eyes that reflected my headlights. The eyes looked intelligent. That's what freaked me out the most. It wasn't just startled like a deer would be. It was processing what it was seeing. The thing must have been at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Its shoulders were so broad they almost spanned half the road. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in these massive hands. I remember noticing there were 5 fingers, not claws like a bear would have. For what felt like forever, but was probably just a few seconds, we just stared at each other. Then I did something so stupid. I flipped on my high beams to get a better look. That's when everything went to hell. As soon as the brighter lights hit it, the creature let out this, I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't a growl or a scream. It was this piercing roar that actually made my windows vibrate. I could feel it in my chest. It threw its head back, exposing these yellowish teeth, and just let loose this sound that didn't belong in this world. Then it charged. I didn't even have time to put the car in reverse. This thing crossed those 30 feet in like 2 strides and slammed onto my hood with enough force that my whole car rocked backward. I heard the metal crunch under its weight. The springs in my seat compressed from the impact. I remember screaming, but I couldn't hear myself over its roaring. Its face was right there at my windshield, this pointed head and these massive shoulders filling my entire field of vision. The thing was so close I could see steam coming off its body in the cold air. It was pounding on my hood, creating these deep dents in the metal. Each time its fists came down, my whole car shook. Those eyes were fixed right on me, not like an animal's eyes. There was rage there, intelligence. It knew exactly what it was doing. I finally managed to shift into reverse. My tires spun in the dirt before catching, and I shot backward, nearly going into the ditch. The creature fell forward as I moved, its massive hands slapping against my windshield. For a split second, I thought the glass would break. Then I was moving, backing up faster than I should have on that dirt road. The thing stood up in the road, silhouetted in my headlights. It was still screaming, beating its chest with these massive fists. I cranked the wheel and did a wild 3-point turn, nearly hitting a tree. As I straightened out, I caught one last glimpse of it in my rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, watching me flee. I drove home going 80 on dirt roads designed for 30, convinced the whole time that this thing was somehow chasing me, that I'd see it in my rear view any second. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel. I kept checking the mirrors, terrified I'd see it running after me. When I got home, I locked myself in the house and sat up all night with my dad's old shotgun across my lap. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face at my windshield. The next morning in daylight, I went out to look at my car. The hood had 4 distinct dents in it, deep enough that you could lay your hand in them. The metal was actually torn in one spot. My windshield had these smears on it, like something oily had pressed against the glass. My dad came over later that day after I called him. He's an old-school New Hampshire guy, been hunting these woods his whole life. When I told him what happened, he just laughed and said I'd hit a moose. Said they sometimes get aggressive during rutting season. But I've seen moose before. This wasn't a damn moose. A moose doesn't stand on 2 legs. A moose doesn't have hands with fingers. A moose doesn't look at you with eyes that understand what you are. My dad didn't believe me, but he stopped laughing when he saw the hood. He got real quiet studying those dents. He measured one with his hand. It was bigger than his spread fingers. He made some comment about the moose must have been a big bull, but I could tell he was unsettled. He hasn't brought it up since. I tried researching online afterward, found some reports of Bigfoot sightings in the White Mountains going back decades. Most were just glimpses through trees or weird sounds at night. Nothing like what I experienced, nothing about them being aggressive or attacking vehicles. The weirdest part is how specific my memory is of certain details, like how its hair moved in the wind, not like fur, more like human hair but coarser, the way its chest expanded when it roared, the smell that filled my car even through the closed windows, like wet dog mixed with something musky and rotten. I've told exactly 3 people about this. My dad, who thinks I hit a moose, my best friend, who thinks I fell asleep at the wheel and dreamed it, and my girlfriend at the time, who broke up with me 2 weeks later because I refused to drive on back roads after dark anymore. I got the hood fixed eventually, told the body shop I hit a deer. The guy gave me a funny look when he saw the damage pattern, but didn't ask questions. Cost me $800 I didn't really have. It's been 6 years now. I still live in the same area, still work the same job. But I take the long way home now, stick to the paved roads, even though it adds 20 minutes to my drive. And when I absolutely have to take dirt roads at night, I keep my high beams off. Sometimes when I'm home alone and it's quiet, I swear I can still hear that roar in the distance, probably just the wind, or my mind playing tricks. But I keep the shotgun closer these days, just in case. I don't know what I saw that night. Logically, I know there aren't supposed to be 9-foot-tall, hairy humanoids roaming the forests of New Hampshire. But logic doesn't explain those dents in my hood or the terror I felt when those eyes locked onto mine. All I know is there's something out there in those woods that science says shouldn't exist. Something intelligent enough to stand its ground when threatened. Something powerful enough to rock my car and dent solid metal with its fists. And sometimes, on cold, clear nights like that one, I find myself staring out my windows into the darkness at the edge of the trees behind my house, wondering if it's out there watching, wondering if it remembers me the way I remember it. I still don't turn my high beams on when I drive through those woods. Story 3. I've been holding this in for 10 years, and I think it's finally time to share what happened to me back in 2013. I've told a few people over the years, but most think I'm crazy or making it up. I'm not. I know what I saw, and it stayed with me ever since. I was living in a small house outside Galena, Illinois at the time. If you've never been there, it's beautiful country, rolling hills, dense woods, and not a whole lot of people. I'd moved there a few years before because I wanted some peace and quiet, and I got plenty of that, especially in winter when everything slows down. That particular winter was brutal. We're talking old-school Midwest winter, the kind where the temperature stays below freezing for weeks at a time, and the snow just keeps piling up. By mid-January, we'd already had several major storms, and I was getting pretty sick of shoveling. The night it happened, we were in the middle of yet another snowstorm. The forecast said 2 feet by morning, and it was coming down hard. I'd been going out every few hours to clear my porch and the path to my truck. If you let it build up too much, it becomes impossible to manage. I had a simple routine: shovel, come in to warm up, repeat. Around 11 that night, I figured I'd do one last round of shoveling before bed. My shepherd mix, Cooper, usually loved the snow and would bound around the yard whenever I went out. He was a great companion, especially living out there alone. I remember pulling on my boots and heavy coat, grabbing my gloves, and calling to Cooper that we were heading outside. The second I opened that door, something felt wrong. I can't really explain it any better than that. It was like walking into a room where people had just been arguing. That heavy, tense feeling in the air. The hair on my arms stood up despite my thick coat. I've lived in rural areas most of my life. I'm used to wildlife, deer, coyotes, the occasional black bear. This wasn't that. This was different. It felt deliberate, like the woods were holding their breath. I remember standing there on the porch, hesitating, looking out at the falling snow illuminated by my porch light. Cooper was right beside me, and that's when I noticed something really odd. He wasn't excited like usual. He was completely still, ears perked forward, staring into the darkness. "What is it, boy?" I asked him, thinking maybe he'd spotted a deer or something. When I opened the door wider to let him out, he shot past me like he always did, but then something strange happened. He got about halfway across the yard, stopped dead in his tracks, then spun around and bolted back to the door. He was whining. Not a normal whine, but this high-pitched, anxious sound I'd never heard him make before. He was scratching at the door, desperate to get back inside. That really got to me. Cooper was no coward. He'd chase off coyotes twice his size without hesitation. Whatever was out there had spooked him badly. I stepped fully onto the porch, shovel in hand, trying to peer into the darkness beyond the reach of my porch light. The snow was coming down so thick it was like looking through static on an old TV. That's when I saw them. 2 eyes, glowing in the darkness, staring directly at me. They were amber-colored, reflecting my porch light, and they were high, much higher than a deer's would be. At first I thought maybe a deer was standing on a snowbank, but the positioning was all wrong. These eyes were perfectly still, unblinking and fixed directly on me. They weren't moving side to side like a deer's would when it's alert and nervous. I squinted, trying to make out whatever was behind those eyes. Slowly, I began to discern a shape, dark, incredibly tall and wide. It was just standing there, maybe 40 yards from my porch, partially obscured by the falling snow and the darkness, but I could tell it was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe more. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear standing on its hind legs? No, bears don't come out during snowstorms, and they certainly don't stand still like that. A neighbor playing a prank, out here in the middle of nowhere during a blizzard at 11 at night. No way. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. The thing, whatever it was, didn't move. It just watched me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was being sized up. That's when the panic hit me. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Without thinking, I dropped the shovel right there on the porch, rushed inside with Cooper, and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the deadbolt. Cooper was still whining, pacing around the living room. I peeked through the window, half expecting to see those eyes right outside the glass, but there was nothing, just the swirling snow and darkness. I called my grandfather right away. He'd been a hunter his whole life and knew the woods better than anyone I knew. When I told him what I'd seen, he laughed it off, saying I'd probably spotted a deer standing on a snowbank and my imagination had done the rest. But I knew better. I'd seen plenty of deer in my life. This wasn't that. I barely slept that night. I kept getting up to check the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. Cooper wouldn't settle either. He kept growling at the windows, his hackles raised. It was the longest night of my life. The next morning, I cautiously went outside to look for tracks. The snow had continued all night, dropping another foot, so any evidence was long buried. But I felt it, that same uneasiness in the air, like something had changed in the woods around my house. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. I'd hear odd noises at night, not the normal sounds of the forest, but something deliberate. I started noticing knocking sounds coming from the woods behind my barn. Not random sounds, but steady, rhythmic thunks, like someone hitting a tree with a stick. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Always in sets of 3. It definitely wasn't a woodpecker. It was too forceful, too deliberate, and happened at night when woodpeckers are inactive. About a week after the initial incident, my 10-year-old son was visiting for the weekend. He was collecting eggs from our chicken coop when he came running back to the house, white as a sheet. He said he'd heard a scream behind the coop. Not an animal scream, but not quite human either. He described it as high-pitched and wailing, almost like a woman in pain, but wrong somehow. I'd never seen him so shaken up. I started researching, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I stumbled across accounts of Bigfoot encounters. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I do. I was skeptical at first too. But the more I read, the more things lined up. The height, the eye shine, the knocking sounds, even the screams my son described, all classic Bigfoot behavior according to witnesses. I never saw those eyes again, at least not directly. But for months afterward, I'd catch glimpses of movement at the edge of the woods, something dark and large, moving between the trees. Never clear enough to make out details, just enough to know something was there, watching. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I'd hear those knocks again, always in 3s. I installed motion sensor lights all around my property after that. They'd go off randomly in the middle of the night, but by the time I'd look outside, there would be nothing there. Just the sense that something had been. Cooper was never the same after that night. He refused to go out alone after dark, and he'd bark at the tree line for no apparent reason. Dogs know things we don't. I've spent years trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, some trick of light and shadow during a snowstorm, but deep down I know what I saw. Something was watching me that night, something tall and dark that had no business being in the woods of Illinois. I still live in the same house. The strange occurrences eventually stopped, but I've never forgotten. I keep a camera by the door now, just in case, and I never ever go out to shovel snow at night anymore. To this day, I can close my eyes and see those amber eyes staring at me through the falling snow. unblinking, intelligent, and definitely not human. Story 4. I've debated for years whether to share this. My friends think I'm crazy, and my family just rolls their eyes when I bring it up. But I know what I saw that day in Angelina National Forest, and I still get chills thinking about it. This happened back in May of 2002, May 11th to be exact. I remember the date because it was the weekend after my girlfriend Jessica's birthday, and I'd planned this camping trip as a surprise. We'd been dating for about 8 months, and she'd been stressed with her nursing program, so I wanted to do something special to help her unwind. I knew this spot in Angelina from when I was a kid. My uncle used to take me fishing there. There's this clearing near an old fire lookout that not many people know about. It's off the main trails, kind of tucked away, which is why I liked it. Usually, you can camp there without running into another soul. We arrived around 10 in the morning. The weather was perfect, not too hot yet, maybe mid-70s. We set up our tent, a basic 2-person Coleman I'd borrowed from my buddy Mike, then spent most of the day hiking. Jessica loves photography, so she was taking pictures of everything. Wildflowers, weird-shaped trees, a hawk we spotted circling above. Normal stuff. Nothing unusual happened during the day. We got back to our campsite around 4:30, and that's when I noticed we weren't alone anymore. A group of college kids, probably 5 or 6 of them, had set up at the far end of the clearing, maybe 150 yards from us. You could tell they were college kids from their gear alone. Expensive tents, brand new backpacks, that kind of thing. They were being pretty loud, playing music, laughing. Not obnoxious exactly, just present. Jessica wasn't bothered by them. She started getting dinner ready, just some canned stew we were planning to heat up on our little portable stove. I remember I was gathering more firewood for later when something caught my eye. There was movement in the woods across from us, up the hill maybe 75 yards. At first I thought it was just the wind moving branches, but then I realized the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful. I stepped behind this big bush so whatever it was wouldn't see me watching. That's when I saw it, something dark moving between the trees. It wasn't rushing, it was moving carefully, stopping every few steps. My first thought was bear, but something felt off about the way it moved. I stayed perfectly still, just watching. The thing was working its way down the hillside, using the trees as cover. I couldn't get a clear look because of the shadows and foliage, but I could tell it was big. Then it reached a gap in the trees, not a clearing exactly, but a spot where the trees were spaced wider apart. That's when I could see it clearly, and my blood went cold. This thing was walking on 2 legs. Not like a bear occasionally stands up, but actually walking upright the way humans do. But it wasn't human, not even close. It seemed most interested in the college students. They were making all the noise after all. It stopped at the edge of the forest about halfway down the hill, partially hidden behind some brush. I could tell it was watching them, just studying them. They had no idea it was there. I've never seen anything like it. It was covered in dark brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like hair. On its arms, the hair hung down maybe 4 or 5 inches long. Its face had less hair, mainly around the jaw and sides. Hard to describe the face exactly. Not quite human, not quite ape. From where I was standing, I'd guess it was about 100, maybe 125 yards away from me. Based on the trees near it, I'd estimate it stood around 6.5 feet tall, maybe taller. Its body was massive, broad shoulders that narrowed at the waist and hips. Even through all that hair, you could see the muscles. The thing squatted down on its haunches, leaning from side to side, like it was trying to look through gaps in the branches for a better view. Every so often, it would raise its head slightly, as if it was sniffing the air. I don't know how long I stood there watching it, probably only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. My heart was pounding so hard, I was afraid it would hear it. I didn't dare move. Then something happened that still gives me nightmares. Without any warning, The creature suddenly turned its entire upper body in my direction. Not just its head, its whole torso rotated toward me. It was like it sensed me watching. It froze. We both did. For maybe 5 or 10 seconds, it just stared directly at me. Its eyes were dark, set deep under a prominent brow. The head shape was strange, kind of like an egg turned sideways, with a strong jawline and a flattened nose. Those eyes, though, they weren't animal eyes. There was something in them, intelligence, awareness. In that moment, I knew it knew I was watching it, and it knew that I knew what it was. After what felt like forever, it slowly backed into the brush. It didn't turn around. It backed away, still facing me. I caught glimpses of it retreating up the hill, using the trees for cover again. The way it moved was so deliberate, so careful, not panicked or rushed. I stood there for I don't know how long, unable to move. My legs felt like they were made of cement. I was terrified it might circle around and come for me. Eventually, Jessica called out, asking if I was okay. Her voice snapped me out of it. I mumbled something about being right there, and somehow made my legs work again. When I got back to our camp, she could tell something was wrong. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. She asked me what happened, and I just said, I thought I saw something in the woods. She grabbed her binoculars and looked in the direction I pointed, but by then, the thing was long gone. She did say she saw something dark moving through the trees far uphill, but she just assumed it was a bear. I didn't correct her. Not then. I couldn't exactly say, hey, I just saw Bigfoot watching those college kids. She would have thought I was nuts. Hell, part of me thought I was nuts. We ate dinner, but I couldn't taste anything. I kept scanning the tree line, jumping at every sound. The college kids kept partying into the night, getting louder as they drank more. Part of me was grateful for their noise. I figured it would keep that thing away. I barely slept that night. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me wide awake, heart racing. Jessica slept fine, completely unaware. Around 3 in the morning, the college kids finally quieted down, and the forest got eerily silent. That's when I was most afraid. But nothing happened. The next morning, we packed up early. I wanted to get the hell out of there. As we were driving home, Jessica finally asked me straight up what had spooked me the day before. I hesitated, then told her everything. About the creature walking on 2 legs. About its size, the way it moved, those intelligent eyes. How it had stared right at me. She didn't laugh or call me crazy, which I appreciated, but I could tell she didn't believe me. She suggested maybe it was just a bear, and the shadows and distance played tricks on my eyes. Or maybe I'd been working too hard lately, and my imagination got the better of me. I dropped it after that. No point arguing about something she didn't see. It's been over 20 years now, and I've never gone back to that spot in Angelina. I've gone camping since then, but always in open areas with lots of people around. I've never told many people about what I saw. The few I have told react like Jessica did. They humor me, but don't really believe me. But here's the thing. I know what bears look like. I've seen plenty of them while hiking and camping over the years. What I saw that day wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It wasn't my imagination. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, remembering those eyes staring at me, recognizing me. I wonder if it's still out there, watching people from the edges of the forest. I wonder if anyone else has seen it. I wonder if it remembers me the way I remember it. I've read books about Sasquatch sightings since then. Some of the descriptions match what I saw almost exactly. I know most people don't believe these creatures exist. Before that day, I didn't either. But when you see something like that with your own eyes, something that shouldn't exist but clearly does, it changes you, makes you question what else might be out there, hiding just beyond our sight. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I know what I saw, and I'll never forget those eyes looking directly into mine, acknowledging me across the clearing. For a few seconds, two completely different species recognized each other, and then just like that, it was gone. Story 5. I still don't sleep well, and it's been almost 5 years now. Every little noise outside our house makes me sit bolt upright in bed. I've told this story to a few close friends, but most people would think I'm crazy, so I've kept it mostly to myself. But I need to get this out there, because I know what I experienced was real. Back in 2011, my wife Sarah and I bought a double wide on a decent plot of land about 5 kilometers west of Caroline, Alberta. For those who don't know the area, it's pretty rural. Our property backed right onto Crown Forest land. We loved the peace and quiet, the space between us and our nearest neighbors. Sarah worked in Rocky Mountain House, about a 30-minute drive, and I did maintenance work at a few local businesses. It was a good life. We had our Malamute, Rocco, who was the bravest dog I'd ever known. He'd chase bears, confront coyotes. Nothing scared that dog. That's part of why what happened in the fall of 2018 freaked me out so badly. It was the week before Thanksgiving when things started getting weird. At first it was just Rocco acting strange. He started growling at nothing, or what seemed like nothing to us, while staring at the kitchen. He'd lie by the front door, facing inward, like he was guarding us from something inside the house. When I'd check, there was nothing there. I brushed it off as him, maybe hearing mice in the walls. It happens in these older homes, especially as the weather turns colder. But then, around 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, we heard this dull bang on the far side of the house. It wasn't super loud, but it was forceful enough that it rattled the dresser against the wall. Rocco went nuts, barking his head off. But the weird thing was, he wouldn't go investigate. Normally, he'd be the first one at the door, ready to charge whatever made the noise. Instead, he pushed against my leg, like he was trying to keep me from going toward that end of the trailer. I grabbed my flashlight and checked outside anyway. Nothing. Just the dark tree line about 70 meters from our back windows and the usual night sounds. I figured maybe a branch had fallen on the roof or something. The next morning, I walked around the house to see if I could find anything. That's when I noticed 2 large dents in the soil near the spare room window. They looked like footprints, but they were way bigger than my size 11 boots, and they were spaced really far apart, like whatever made them had a massive stride. I took pictures on my phone because I thought maybe I was seeing things. Looking at them later, they still looked like huge footprints to me. That second night is when things got more intense. Around midnight, we heard heavy footsteps on our front porch. Not like a raccoon or even a deer. These were heavy, deliberate steps. Rocco, who normally would have been raising hell, was hiding behind our couch, whimpering. I grabbed my hunting rifle and went to check it out, but by the time I got to the door, the steps had stopped. I flipped on the porch light and looked out the window, but there was nothing visible. I caught a whiff of something, though. This sour smell, like wet dog mixed with rotting leaves. For a whole week, this, whatever it was, came back every single night. Sometimes it would rap on the walls under windows. Other times, we'd hear something dragging along the siding of the house. One morning, I found fresh scrapes high up on the wall, higher than a bear could reach standing on its hind legs, and definitely not from any branches since we'd trimmed everything back from the house. By Thursday night, we were both exhausted and on edge. Sarah wanted to go stay in a hotel, but I was stubborn. This was our home, and I wasn't going to be scared off by some animal. Around 2 in the morning, we heard dragging sounds by our bedroom window, followed by a loud whack against the wall that knocked a picture frame right off its nail. That was it for me. I grabbed my rifle, pulled on my boots, and went outside. The motion sensor light by our back door came on as I stepped out, but it didn't reach all the way to the tree line. I stood there, rifle ready, scanning the darkness. That's when I saw it. Or rather, I saw something massive move behind our woodshed. I couldn't make out details, but whatever it was blocked out the stars momentarily as it moved. It was tall, taller than a person should be. I heard deep chest breathing, the kind that comes from something big. I had my finger on the trigger, but I didn't fire. Our propane tank was near the woodshed, and I wasn't about to risk hitting that. Plus, I still wasn't entirely sure what I was looking at. After a few seconds, the motion light timed out, and everything went dark again. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, straining to hear or see anything, but whatever it was had gone quiet. Friday night was the worst. We'd both finally fallen asleep around 1 in the morning when we heard breathing directly outside our bedroom window. Not animal panting, but slow, deliberate breaths. Then there was a single thump against the wall, like a hand pressing firmly against it. Sarah was squeezing my arm so tight it left bruises. Rocco was under our bed, making these little whining noises I'd never heard from him before. I was too terrified to move. We lay there, listening to the breathing for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then it just stopped. The silence afterward was almost worse than the breathing. The next morning, I found muddy, finger-like smears on the siding below our bedroom window. They were spread wide, like a handprint from something with fingers much longer than a human's. There were more of those wide footprints too, leading from our house toward the bush. That was the last night of the visits. They stopped as suddenly as they'd started. We never figured out why it came or why it left. Rocco eventually went back to his normal self, though he still gets anxious sometimes at night. Sarah keeps heavy curtains drawn on all our windows now, even during the day. I've spent countless hours researching what it could have been. I'm not some conspiracy theorist or someone who believes in monsters. I've hunted in these woods for years. I know what bears sound like, what moose can do. This wasn't that. Whatever visited us that week stood tall, moved with purpose, and seemed interested in us specifically. It didn't try to break in or attack, but it wanted us to know it was there. The fact that it could terrify a dog who would normally take on a grizzly tells me all I need to know. I've never said this out loud to anyone but Sarah, but I believe we had a Sasquatch checking us out. I know how that sounds. Before this happened, I would have laughed at anyone telling me this story, but I know what I experienced. I know what I saw and heard and smelled. We still live in the same house. I installed more motion lights, security cameras, and reinforced our doors. But I've never caught anything on camera, and we've never had another visit. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the tree line. Other times I convince myself it was all just some weird series of coincidences and animal encounters that my sleep-deprived brain pieced together into something more sinister. But then I remember Rocco's fear. I remember those massive footprints. I remember the breathing outside our window and those finger smears that were higher than I could reach, standing on my tiptoes. Something visited us that week. Something that walked on 2 legs and had hands. Something that watched us and wanted us to know we were being watched. And sometimes, when I'm out in the yard at dusk and the wind shifts just right, I catch that same sour smell drifting from the forest, and I know it's still out there somewhere. Story 6. I've been sitting on this experience for almost 8 months now, and I honestly don't know if I'll ever fully process what happened. I've always considered myself a rational person. I write code for a living, for crying out loud. I deal in logic and reason. But what happened to me last summer defies everything I thought I knew about our world. I needed to get away. Work had been absolute hell. 3 failed deployments in 2 weeks, a client threatening to pull their contract, and my boss breathing down my neck about deadlines we all knew were impossible. So I took a Friday off and decided to head out to Mount St. Helens for a solo hiking trip. Just me, the wilderness, and absolutely no Slack notifications. I'd been researching this particular trail for months. It's not on any of the popular hiking apps or guidebooks. A co-worker who's big into backcountry hiking had mentioned it casually, saying it was pristine because most tourists don't know it exists. Perfect. I wanted solitude more than anything. The drive from Seattle took about 3 hours. I parked my truck at this tiny pull-off that barely qualified as a parking spot. Just a widened section of gravel on the forest road. There wasn't another car in sight, which was exactly what I wanted. The weather couldn't have been better, 65 degrees, partly cloudy, with just enough breeze to keep the bugs away. I double-checked my backpack. Tent, sleeping bag, water filter, first aid kit, food for 2 days, extra socks, rain gear because Washington, my phone for emergencies and photos, hatchet, and a small cooking kit. Everything I needed for a weekend of solitude. The hike-in was gorgeous. 6 miles of dense forest, ferns everywhere, massive cedar and pine trees, and occasional glimpses of the mountain through breaks in the canopy. The trail wasn't well maintained, but that made it feel more authentic somehow. I had to navigate around fallen trees and overgrown sections, but my GPS kept me on track. I didn't see another human being the entire time. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I'd marked for camping, a small clearing about 50 yards from a creek. It was perfect, flat ground for my tent, plenty of firewood nearby, and the soothing sound of running water. I set up camp methodically, the way I always do. Tent facing east so the morning sun would warm it. Sleeping bag and pad arranged inside. Food hung in a tree away from my tent. Bears are no joke in these parts. I gathered firewood, filtered water from the creek, and cooked a simple dinner of dehydrated pasta. As darkness fell, I sat by my small fire, sipping whiskey from my metal cup and feeling the stress of the past few weeks melt away. The forest was alive with normal nighttime sounds, crickets, the occasional owl, rustling leaves, nothing out of the ordinary. I turned in around 10, exhausted from the hike and looking forward to exploring more the next day. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. My watch was in the side pocket of my tent, and I was too terrified to reach for it. What I remember with absolute clarity is the silence. 1 second I was asleep, and the next I was wide awake, heart pounding, because the forest had gone completely, unnaturally silent. No crickets, no nightbirds, nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crushing the forest floor. Whatever was making them was big, much bigger than a person, and it wasn't moving on 4 legs like a bear. These were bipedal steps, distinctly bipedal, 2 feet, walking upright. The footsteps paused about 20 yards from my tent, then slowly, deliberately continued toward me. Closer, closer. My hand found my hatchet, and I gripped it so hard my knuckles hurt. I was completely frozen in place, barely breathing, my sleeping bag pulled up to my chin like a child hiding from monsters. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, deep, rumbling breaths from what had to be a massive chest. My tent was a basic REI 2-person dome, just thin nylon between me and whatever was standing there. I felt pressure against the tent wall, not aggressive, more like curiosity, like it was leaning in to investigate. The smell hit me next. God, that smell, like a wet dog that had rolled in something dead, mixed with a skunk-like musk. It was so strong I had to fight the urge to gag. I stayed absolutely still. My mind was racing through options. Play dead, make noise, try to scare it away, run. But my body wouldn't respond to any commands. I just lay there, clutching my hatchet, waiting. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the pressure against my tent disappeared. The heavy footsteps slowly moved away, and gradually, the normal forest sounds returned. I didn't sleep another minute that night. I just lay there, straining to hear any sign of its return, until the first light of dawn filtered through my tent. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent and peek outside, everything looked normal at first. But then I walked around to the back of my tent, and there they were. Footprints. Massive footprints pressed deep into the soft mud near the creek. I put my boot next to one for scale. It was easily 6 inches longer than my size 11 hiking boot and twice as wide. I could make out distinct toe impressions. The ferns behind my tent were broken and pushed aside where something very large had stood. I should have packed up right then. Any rational person would have. but I'd planned this trip for weeks, and part of me was trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear walking funny. Maybe I'd dreamed the bipedal walking. Maybe there was some natural explanation for what had happened. So I made coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to stick to my original plan. A day hike to a ridge about 4 miles from my campsite that supposedly had amazing views of the valley. The entire time I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Every few minutes, I'd hear a twig snap behind me or leaves rustle in a way that didn't match the breeze. Whenever I'd stop and turn around, there was nothing there, but as soon as I started walking again, I'd hear something keeping pace with me just out of sight in the denser parts of the forest. Around noon, I reached the ridge and sat down to eat my lunch and take in the view. That's when I saw it. About 200 yards below me, moving through a section of forest with less understory, was a massive brown figure, moving on 2 legs. It wasn't a bear. I've seen plenty of bears. This thing had massive shoulders, long arms, and moved with an upright gait that was eerily similar to a human's, but not quite right. It paused behind a massive stump, and I swear to God it was watching me. I couldn't make out facial features at that distance, but I could clearly see its head turn in my direction. We stayed like that, locked in some kind of standoff, for maybe 30 seconds before it deliberately turned and moved deeper into the forest, disappearing from view. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my granola bar. I'd just seen a Sasquatch. A fucking Sasquatch. Not a glimpse or a shadow or something that could have been anything. A clear, unmistakable sighting in broad daylight. Part of my brain was shutting down from shock while another part was racing, cataloging details, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I abandoned my lunch and practically ran back to my campsite. The entire time, I could hear it paralleling my path through the trees, keeping pace with me, but staying just out of sight. It wasn't trying to catch me. It seemed more like it was escorting me, making sure I got back to my camp. I threw everything into my backpack as quickly as possible, not caring about my usual meticulous packing process. I just needed to get back to my truck. The 6-mile hike out felt like 60. Every step, I expected to come face to face with the creature. Every time the trail curved, I braced myself for what might be waiting around the corner. About 2 miles from where I'd parked, the trail passed by a rocky outcropping. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw it clearly, standing partially hidden behind a massive cedar tree. It was at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders twice the width of mine. Its fur was a dark brown, almost black in places, matted with leaves and forest debris. Its arms hung down almost to its knees. But what strikes me most, even now, was that it wasn't acting aggressive. It was just watching, following, like it was curious about me, or maybe making sure I left its territory safely. Our eyes met, I'm certain of it, and in that moment I understood that if it had wanted to harm me, it could have done so easily at any point. I didn't run. Something told me running would be the wrong move. I just turned and continued hiking out, faster but not panicked. I could still hear it moving parallel to me, all the way until I reached the gravel road where my truck was parked. Only then did the sound stop. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see it following me somehow. My hands didn't stop shaking until I was back on the interstate with other cars around me. I haven't told many people about this. Who would believe me? I work with technology and data. My world is built on provable facts. But I know what I saw. I know what followed me through those woods. It's been 8 months and I still wake up sometimes smelling that musky, skunky odor. I still flinch when I hear twigs snap while hiking. I've researched countless Sasquatch encounters since then, and so many details match my experience. The silence of the forest, the curiosity without aggression, the distinct smell. I still go hiking, but never alone anymore, and never in remote areas. Whatever I encountered that day fundamentally changed my relationship with the wilderness. There are things in our forests that most people will never see, things that live by different rules and have managed to stay hidden despite our endless expansion. I don't know if I'll ever fully process what happened to me at Mount St. Helens, but I know with absolute certainty that I wasn't alone in those woods, and that whatever was watching me wasn't something science has properly explained. Story 7. I've been a biologist for almost a decade now, and I've spent more time in the wilderness than most people ever will. I've tracked wildlife in 5 different states, slept under the stars in some pretty remote places, and I've always prided myself on understanding the natural world. But what happened last October in Wyoming National Forest has completely shaken that confidence. I'm not someone who jumps at shadows or believes in monsters, but I honestly don't know how to explain what I experienced. My wife and I had planned this camping trip for weeks. We both needed a break from work, and fall in North Carolina is beautiful. Perfect temperatures, changing leaves, fewer bugs. We brought our 2 dogs, Jasper and Luna, who are both experienced trail dogs and have never given us trouble in the backcountry. We arrived at the campground on October 23rd and deliberately chose a site at the far edge of the camping area. It was site number 14, and it backed right up to a thick section of forest. The campground wasn't particularly crowded, but I still wanted some privacy. The nearest occupied site was probably 50 yards away. I remember joking with my wife that we had the penthouse suite because our site had a little elevated area perfect for our tent. We spent the first day hiking some nearby trails, cooking dinner over the fire, and just relaxing. Nothing unusual happened that first night. The dogs were calm, we slept well, everything was normal. The second day, October 24th, I decided to set up my camping hammock. My wife isn't a fan of hammock sleeping, but I love it when the weather's good. Instead of setting it up at our campsite, I found a nice spot about 30 feet into the forest behind our site. I positioned it so that when I was lying in it, I could see back toward our campsite with the dark forest at my back. I figured this would give me a nice view of the stars through the tree canopy while still keeping our camp in sight. That evening, we had another normal, pleasant time. We grilled some steaks, had a couple beers, and played cards by lantern light. Around 11, my wife decided to turn in with the dogs in the tent. I wasn't tired yet, so I told her I'd sleep in the hammock and join her if it got too cold. I grabbed my sleeping bag, headlamp, water bottle and phone and headed to the hammock. The night was clear and cool, maybe around 45 degrees, perfect hammock weather with a good sleeping bag. I settled in, looked up at the stars for a while, and eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly around 2:30 in the morning. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, the distinct sound of branches breaking, coming from deeper in the forest behind me, maybe 50 feet away. Now I've heard all kinds of animals moving through the woods at night. This wasn't that. When deer or bears walk through underbrush, there's a pattern to the sound. Movement, snap, movement, snap. This was different. Whatever was making this noise was staying in one place and deliberately snapping branches. Snap, pause, snap, pause. It was methodical. I froze in my hammock, barely breathing. Then, from over my left shoulder, I heard something that made my skin crawl. A deep, resonant sound, unlike anything I've ever heard in the forest before. It was a low, forceful snort, but with the resonance of a lion's roar, drawn out like a human sigh. I can't adequately describe it, but it was powerful enough that I could almost feel the vibration. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The branch breaking continued. Then I began hearing something even stranger. What sounded like forceful single wing flaps every few seconds. The pattern became snap, whoosh, whoosh. But whatever this was, it wasn't flying away. The sounds remained in the same location. I lay perfectly still for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 minutes. My mind was racing through possibilities. Bear, elk, some kind of bird. Nothing made sense. Finally, I decided I needed to check on my wife and the dogs. Very slowly, I sat up in the hammock and turned on my headlamp. The forest behind me was dark and still. I couldn't see anything unusual. The breaking sound stopped the moment my light came on. I got out of the hammock as quietly as possible and hurried back to our campsite. When I reached the tent, I found my wife and both dogs sound asleep. The dogs weren't on alert at all, which was weird considering how sensitive they usually are to wildlife. I debated waking my wife, but decided against it. What would I say? There's something in the woods making weird noises. I'd sound ridiculous. Instead, I stood outside the tent for a few minutes trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to just crawl into the tent and forget about it, but the rational, scientific part of my brain was curious. I needed to understand what I'd heard, so I did something that probably sounds stupid now. I decided to go back to the hammock. But first, I deliberately broke a few small branches around the edge of our campsite, marking my territory in the most primal way by urinating around the perimeter. I know that sounds weird, but it felt like the right thing to do at the time, some kind of instinctive response. I walked back to the hammock, my headlamp scanning the forest continuously. Everything was quiet. I climbed back in, still on high alert, within seconds, and I mean literally seconds, of me settling in and turning off my light. The breaking sounds resumed. Same spot, same pattern. Snap, pause, snap, whoosh. I immediately turned my headlamp back on and pointed it toward the sounds. Nothing visible, and the sounds stopped instantly. I kept the light on for maybe 30 seconds, then turned it off. Within 5 seconds, the sounds started again. I repeated this experiment several times. Light on, silence, light off, snap, whoosh. It was responding to my light. Whatever was out there was intelligent enough to understand the connection between my headlamp and being seen. After the 5th or 6th time doing this, I felt a wave of fear wash over me, unlike anything I've experienced before. This wasn't normal wildlife behavior. Nothing I knew of in these forests behaved this way. The breaking sounds were getting more frequent, and I swear they seemed to be coming from slightly closer now. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my stuff, got out of the hammock, and walked as calmly as I could back to the tent. I didn't run, though every instinct was screaming at me to do so. I didn't want to trigger a chase response from whatever was out there. When I reached the tent, I quietly slipped inside. My wife stirred but didn't fully wake up. The dogs, strangely, were still completely calm. I lay there in the tent, ears straining to hear what was happening outside. For about 15 minutes, I could still hear the snapping sounds in the distance. Then there was one final extremely loud crack, like a 4-inch branch or small tree trunk being split in half. After that, silence, complete silence. Not even the normal forest sounds of insects or distant owls. Nothing. I barely slept the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, I was the first one up. I waited until my wife and the dogs were awake before venturing back to the hammock area. I didn't tell her what had happened yet. I wanted to check the area in daylight first. What I found still gives me chills. There were 3 rock piles near where my hammock had been. 2 old ones with small trees actually growing through them, and 1 newer looking one. I'm certain they weren't natural formations. They were deliberately stacked stones, the kind sometimes called cairns. But why would someone build cairns deep in the forest, away from any trail? Even more disturbing was the forest floor itself. In most forests, especially in fall, there are dead branches everywhere. But in this specific area, the ground was unusually clean, almost as if something had been collecting all the dead wood. The implications of this, that whatever had been breaking sticks had brought them to that location, was too unsettling to ignore. I took photos of the rock piles and the unusually clean forest floor. When I showed my wife and told her what happened, she was skeptical but concerned. We decided to pack up and leave, cutting our trip short by a day. I've spent months trying to make sense of what happened. I've researched every known animal in the region. I've looked into weather phenomena. other campers playing pranks, everything I can think of. Nothing explains the combination of sounds I heard or the deliberate response to my light. I've gone from being a complete skeptic about unexplained forest entities to, well, I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that something intelligent was in those woods with me that night, something that wanted me to know it was there, but didn't want to be seen. I haven't been back to Wari, and I'm not sure I ever will. Some things in nature aren't meant to be understood, I guess. But I still lie awake sometimes, hearing that snap whoosh in my mind, wondering what was watching me from the darkness. Story 8. I've been driving the same route to work for almost 3 years now. It's a back road outside Lake Placid that cuts about 15 minutes off my commute. Not a lot of traffic, especially during my night shifts. I know every curve, every pothole, every spot where deer might jump out. At least I thought I did. This happened just last month, early January of 2024. I'm not the type to make up stories or exaggerate. Ask anyone who knows me. I'm the skeptical one, the guy who needs proof. I've always rolled my eyes at people who claim to see strange things in the woods. But now, I don't know what to think anymore. I was heading to my shift at the distribution center. It was around 8:45 at night, completely dark. No moonlight because of the heavy cloud cover, and no streetlights on this stretch. Just my headlights cutting through the darkness. I had the radio on low, some podcast about football stats, and was sipping my coffee just like any other night. The road there winds through some pretty dense woods. Not many houses, just wilderness on both sides for a good stretch. There's this one particular section with a guardrail that runs about a quarter mile, where the road dips near a marshy area. I was approaching that section, going about 55, when I saw movement to my left. At first, I thought it was just another deer. We get them all the time, and I've had more near misses than I can count. This deer jumped the guardrail and bolted across the road, but something was off about it. It kept looking back over its shoulder, which I'd never seen before. Deer usually just run straight across in panic. I slowed down, thinking there might be more deer following it. That's when I saw it. Something stepped over the guardrail. Not climbed, not jumped. Stepped over it like it was nothing more than a curb. My headlights caught it full on, and I instinctively hit the brakes, coming to almost a complete stop about 30 yards away. Whatever this thing was, it was massive. My first thought was bear, but no, bears don't stand like that. This thing was upright on 2 legs, perfectly balanced, perfectly at ease. It had to be close to 9 feet tall. My brother is 6'7" and built like a linebacker, but this thing would have towered over him by at least 2 feet. The body was covered in thick, matted hair, a dark, reddish-brown color, almost like rusted metal, but with hints of black mixed in. Not fur exactly, more like hair, especially longer around the shoulders, and it was built like nothing I've ever seen before. Massive across the chest and shoulders, with arms that hung way lower than any humans should. The proportions were all wrong for a person, even a person in some kind of costume, but it was the eyes that got me. Large and set deep in a face that I couldn't make out clearly, they caught the headlights and reflected back an orange-amber color. Not red like deer eyes in headlights, but this burnt orange that seemed to glow from within. The face was mostly shadowed under a heavy brow, but I could see enough to know this wasn't human. For what felt like forever, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds, it just stood there staring directly at me. Not startled, not scared, just observing. Then it turned and crossed the entire 2-lane road in 2 strides. 2. My car is just over 16 feet long, and this road is standard width, so we're talking about crossing 30 feet in 2 steps. It didn't run or hurry. It just took these massive, fluid strides and then cleared the ditch on the other side of the road, a ditch that's at least 6 feet wide, without breaking its stride. Then it was gone into the tree line. I sat there in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I couldn't move. My coffee had spilled all over my lap, but I didn't even feel it. All I could think was, that wasn't possible. I didn't just see that. After maybe a minute, a car came up behind me and honked. The sound snapped me back to reality, and I realized I was sitting stopped in the middle of the road. I drove the rest of the way to work on autopilot, shaking the whole time. When I got to work, my supervisor asked if I was okay, because apparently I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I mumbled something about almost hitting a deer and went about my shift. I didn't tell anyone what I'd really seen. How could I? I'm not the Bigfoot guy. I don't believe in that stuff, or at least I didn't. About halfway through my shift, I was still rattled, and one of my co-workers, Jen, noticed. We were on break, and she kept asking what was wrong. Finally, I just told her. I expected her to laugh, but she got really quiet instead. My dad saw something like that, she said. About 2 years ago, same general area. He was out hunting early morning and saw something matching that description walking through the creek bed. He came home and put his rifle in the closet and didn't go hunting for 6 months after. He doesn't talk about it. That hit me hard. Jen's dad is an old-school outdoorsman who's lived here his whole life. If he saw something that scared him off hunting, that's significant. The next night, I took the main highway to work, added 20 minutes to my drive, but I didn't care. It was 3 days before I worked up the courage to take that back road again, and even then, I only did it because it was still light out. When I reached the spot where it happened, I pulled over. The guardrail looked so ordinary in the daylight. I got out of my car and walked over to where I'd seen it cross. The ground was hard-packed with some gravel, so there were no footprints that I could see. But in the ditch on the far side, I noticed some of the vegetation was bent and broken, like something heavy had pushed through it recently. I took a few pictures with my phone, though they don't show much, just some damaged bushes that could have been caused by anything. I know how thin that evidence is. I know how this sounds. I've spent the last few weeks trying to convince myself it was a bear, or maybe some guy in a costume playing a prank. But who would wear a 9-foot costume in the middle of nowhere at night? And the way it moved, so smooth, so natural. No costume could allow for that kind of movement, those strides. I've lived in Florida my whole life. I know what bears look like, how they move. I know what deer look like, what wild hogs look like. This wasn't any of those. It wasn't anything I've ever seen before or could rationalize. I looked up Bigfoot sightings in Florida after this happened. Turns out there are quite a few, especially in the more rural areas. People call it the skunk ape down here. Before, I would have dismissed all those accounts as delusions or lies. Now I'm not so sure. I drive that road almost every day now, but only during daylight, and I can't help but scan the tree line constantly. My girlfriend noticed I've been different since that night. More on edge, especially in the dark. I finally told her what happened, and she's been supportive, even though I can tell she doesn't fully believe me. I don't blame her. I'm not sure I would believe it either if someone else told me this story. What bothers me most is the way it looked at me. There was intelligence in those eyes, awareness. It wasn't just some animal reacting on instinct. It was evaluating me, making a decision. And then it just walked away, like I wasn't worth its time or attention. I've gone back and forth about reporting this somewhere official, but who would I even tell? The police would think I'm crazy or drunk. Wildlife authorities would probably say the same thing everyone else would, that I saw a bear, or my mind was playing tricks on me in the dark. But I know what I saw. It was there, in the flesh, standing in my headlights. 9 feet tall, covered in that reddish-brown hair with those haunting orange eyes. It was real. I've started carrying a dash cam in my car. Part of me hopes I never see it again, but another part of me wants proof. Something to validate what I experienced, to show I'm not losing my mind. The weirdest part is how this has changed how I see the woods now. I've always loved hiking and fishing, but now when I look into those dense trees, I feel like something might be looking back. Those woods don't feel empty anymore. I don't know if what I saw was a Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it. All I know is that it existed. It was there that night, and it didn't match any known animal that should be in those Florida woods. I still take that road to work when I have to work nights. I don't have much choice unless I want to add 20 minutes each way to my commute. But now I drive it differently, faster, with the doors locked, eyes constantly scanning the trees, and every time I pass that stretch of guardrail, my heart starts racing. Whatever I saw that night, it was real, and it's still out there somewhere, moving through those woods on the outskirts of Lake Placid. Maybe it's watching me every time I drive by, those orange eyes following my car from the darkness between the trees. I don't know what else to say. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just putting this out there because I need to tell someone, and because maybe someone else has seen it too. If you're driving those back roads around Lake Placid at night, keep your eyes open. And if you see a deer running while looking back over its shoulder, don't slow down to let it pass. Speed up and get out of there as fast as you can. Story 9. I've been holding this inside for so long, but I need to finally share what happened to me and my cousin that winter day in '75. I was only 11 years old then, but what we saw that afternoon has stayed with me for decades. Some of you might not believe me. My own family didn't at first, but I know what I saw. I'm Mohawk, born and raised on the reservation. Back then, life was different. We didn't have cell phones or video games keeping us inside. My cousin Layla and I spent most days exploring outdoors, even in the winter when the snow crunched under our boots and our breath made little clouds in the air. That day started like any other. It was early December, cold but not yet bitter winter. School had let out early because of teacher meetings, and Layla had come over to my house. We were bored, and my mom needed something from my aunt's house on the other side of the reservation. Instead of taking the long way around on the road, we decided to cut through the woods. It'll be faster through the trees, I remember telling Layla. Plus, we won't have to deal with any of those teenagers who hang around the corner store. The path through the woods wasn't really a path at all, just a route we'd taken enough times to know by heart. My dad had always warned us to stay on the road, saying the woods weren't always safe, but we were kids and thought we knew better. The old abandoned gravel pits were along the way, a forbidden playground where we sometimes stopped to mess around despite being told to stay away. We set off around 2 in the afternoon. The winter sun was already starting to lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. We wore our winter coats, hats and mittens. Mine were bright red, a Christmas gift from the year before. I remember this so clearly because later I kept thinking how visible I must have been among all that brown and white. About 10 minutes into our walk, I got this weird feeling. It's hard to explain if you've never felt it, like when you're alone in a room but suddenly know you're being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and I found myself looking over my shoulder every few minutes. "Do you feel that?" I asked Layla. "Feel what?" "Like someone's watching us." She shrugged it off. "It's just your imagination, Cheryl." But it wasn't. I know it wasn't. We kept walking, and I tried to ignore the feeling. The woods were quiet that day, too quiet. Usually you'd hear birds or squirrels rustling in the trees, but there was nothing. Just the sound of our boots crunching in the thin layer of snow and our own breathing. When we reached the old gravel pits, we paused. The pits were like giant bowls carved into the earth, with steep sides sloping down about 15 feet to flat bottoms. They'd been abandoned years ago when the company moved operations elsewhere. In summer, they were dusty. In winter, they collected frozen puddles perfect for sliding on. "Want to go down for a minute?" I asked, already moving toward the edge. Layla hesitated. "I don't know. It's getting late." "Just for a minute," I insisted. "Look, that puddle is frozen solid." I didn't wait for her to agree. I sat on the edge of the embankment and slid down on my butt, laughing as I picked up speed. When I reached the bottom, I ran straight for the frozen puddle and started sliding around in my boots like it was an ice rink. "Come on!" I called up to Layla, who was still standing at the top. She was about to follow me down when she suddenly stopped and bent over. "I dropped my glove," she called. It's somewhere in the brush here. While she searched for her glove, I kept playing on the ice. The feeling of being watched had faded a bit, replaced by the simple joy of sliding around. But then it came back stronger than ever. I stopped moving and looked up at the trees surrounding the gravel pit. Nothing but bare branches against the grey sky. A minute later, I heard Layla call my name. Her voice sounded strange, high and tight. "Cheryl, come here, quick." I looked up to see her standing rigid at the top of the embankment. Even from below, I could see her face had gone pale. "What's wrong?" I called back. "Just come here, please." Something in her voice made me move immediately. I scrambled up the slope, my boots slipping on the frozen ground. When I reached the top, Layla grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "What is it?" I asked. She was shaking. "A big black arm just tried to grab me," she whispered. When I was looking for my glove, something reached out from behind that tree. I stared at the tree she was pointing at. It was about 10 feet away, a thick pine with low branches. "Are you sure? Maybe it was just a branch moving in the wind." "There's no wind today," she said, "and I know what I saw. It was an arm, Cheryl, a huge, hairy black arm." My stomach dropped. I believed her instantly because it confirmed the feeling I'd had all along. We weren't alone in these woods. "We need to go," I said. "Now." We turned toward the direction of the road, which was about a quarter-mile away through the trees. We hadn't taken more than 5 steps when Layla suddenly froze again and pointed. "Look," she whispered. About 150 feet away, on the other side of the gravel pit, something was moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was a bear, but then I realized whatever it was stood upright, and its head and shoulders were visible above the treetops. The trees there were at least 12 feet tall. It was massive, covered in dark, matted fur, and it was moving, not toward us, but parallel to our position, walking with long strides through the forest as if the underbrush wasn't even there. "Run," I whispered, and we did. We sprinted toward the road, holding hands so we wouldn't get separated. I remember the sound of our breathing, harsh and panicked, and the way branches whipped at our faces as we ran. Neither of us looked back. When we were about halfway to the road, I made the mistake of glancing to my right. It was there, the same figure we'd seen across the pit, but now it was only about 30 feet away from us, moving through the trees. In the few seconds since we'd first spotted it, it had somehow covered the entire distance around the gravel pit and caught up to us. That's when the true terror hit me. Nothing that big should be able to move so fast and so silently. I still remember seeing its profile through the trees, massive shoulders, no neck to speak of, and a head that seemed to slope directly into those shoulders. It was at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, and though I never saw its face clearly, I felt it watching us. "Don't stop," I gasped to Layla, pulling her forward. We burst out of the tree line onto the road, nearly colliding with a truck that was driving past. The driver honked angrily, but we didn't care. We just kept running until we reached my aunt's house, crashing through the front door without knocking. My aunt found us in her living room, both of us crying and trying to talk at once. "Whoa, whoa," she said, putting her hands on our shoulders. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "We saw it," I gasped between sobs. "We saw Sasquatch." The look on her face changed from concern to disbelief in an instant. "You girls shouldn't make up stories like that." "We're not making it up," Layla protested. "It tried to grab me, and then we saw it walking through the trees. Its head was above the treetops." My aunt sighed. "You probably saw a bear, or maybe a moose. Your imagination's got the better of you." But we knew what we'd seen wasn't a bear or a moose. Bears don't stand upright for that long, and moose don't have arms that reach out from behind trees. What we saw was something else entirely. When we told our parents later that day, they had the same reaction. Nobody believed us. They said we were making it up or had scared ourselves over nothing. But Layla and I knew the truth. We talked about it when no adults were around, comparing what we'd seen, making sure we hadn't imagined it. Our stories never changed, not once. The weeks after were hard. I had nightmares almost every night, dreams of being chased through endless woods by something I couldn't quite see. I refused to walk anywhere near those woods again, choosing the long way around the reservation even if it took twice as long. Some of the kids at school heard about our story and made fun of us for it. Adults would exchange knowing looks when we entered a room, as if to say, "There are those girls with the wild imagination." But as the years passed, something strange happened. Our stories never changed or contradicted each other, even when we were questioned separately. And there were other reports, whispers from other people on the reservation who'd seen strange things in those same woods. Gradually, our families started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we had seen something that day. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that my grandmother finally told me about our tribe's legends regarding what the white people call Bigfoot. In our Mohawk traditions, these beings aren't monsters to be feared, but protective spirits connected to the land. She told me about the sacred underground caves near our reservation, places that, according to legend, connect various Indian reservations through vast tunnel systems. She believed the creature we saw was heading toward one of these entrances. That's why nobody ever finds evidence, she told me. They're not meant to be found. They appear only when they choose to, only to those they choose. Since that day, I've had recurring dreams about these beings. In these dreams, a Sasquatch leads our people underground during a time when the earth is being cleansed by fire. We follow willingly, trusting this ancient protector to keep us safe until it's time to emerge into a new world. I don't know if these dreams mean anything. Maybe they're just my mind's way of making sense of what happened that winter day in '75. Or maybe there's something more, a message, a warning, a glimpse of something to come. What I do know is what I saw that day was real. I saw a being that shouldn't exist according to science, but that has existed in the stories of my people for countless generations. Sometimes I wonder if it chose to reveal itself to us for a reason. To this day, I won't walk in those woods alone. Not out of fear exactly, but out of respect. Those woods belong to something ancient, something that was here long before us and will likely remain long after we're gone. Something that watches from the shadows, moving silently between worlds we can barely comprehend. Story 10. I've never told this story outside my family before. It's been over 40 years now, but what my brother and I saw in the days before Mount St. Helens erupted still gives me chills. I was in 4th grade then, just a kid, but some things you don't forget, no matter how much time passes. It was May 1980. My dad was a logger, and his company had this camp on the flank of Mount St. Helens. When the first earthquake started that spring, they evacuated most of the operation, but they left some equipment up there. Dad needed to check on things, make sure nothing was being vandalized or stolen. Since it was almost summer break, he decided to bring me and my brother Mark along, make a little camping trip out of it. Mom wasn't thrilled about us going up there with all the warnings, but Dad assured her we'd be fine. They're just being cautious, he told her. The mountain's been rumbling for months. We'll be gone before anything happens. I remember being so excited, staying in a real logging camp, just us guys for a whole week. The drive up was beautiful. It was this perfect late spring day, and Mount St. Helens looked so peaceful against the blue sky, you'd never know it was about to blow its top. We got to the camp late afternoon. It was weird seeing it so empty. Usually there'd be dozens of guys around, trucks coming and going, chainsaws buzzing in the distance, but now it was just abandoned cabins and a couple canvas tents still standing. Dad let us pick which tent we wanted to sleep in. There were 3 set up, these big canvas things with wooden platforms underneath. We chose the one farthest from Dad's because we wanted to feel like we were on our own adventure. Dad just laughed and said, "Fine by me, but if you get scared in the night, I don't want to hear it." That first day was just normal camping stuff. We explored around the camp, threw rocks in the creek that ran nearby, helped Dad check inventories of equipment. Nothing weird happened. Dad cooked hot dogs over the fire and told us old logging stories until it got dark. It was the second day when things started getting strange. We woke up and went to check out the third tent, the one nobody was using. Someone or something had torn it to shreds. The canvas was ripped apart. The cots inside were all mangled and the sleeping pads had been shredded. Dad said it was probably a bear looking for food, but I remember the look on his face. He didn't really believe that. "Nothing to worry about, boys," he said, but he moved his rifle from the truck to keep it in his tent after that. We spent that day exploring more, but Dad kept us closer to camp. We could hear the mountains sometimes, these low rumbles that you felt more than heard. That night around the campfire, Dad seemed distracted, kept looking out at the tree line like he was expecting to see something. The third night is when it really happened. I woke up around 3 in the morning needing to pee. I was about to unzip the tent when I heard something walking through the camp. Not like a raccoon or even a bear. These were heavy footsteps, deliberate, like a person, but bigger. I shook Mark awake. "Listen," I whispered. The footsteps were getting closer. Mark's eyes got huge. "What is that?" he mouthed. We crawled to the tent flap and peeked out. The moon was bright enough that we could see pretty well. What I saw next made my blood freeze. There were several large figures standing by the creek, and when I say large, I mean huge. They were at least 7 or 8 feet tall, massive shoulders, covered in what looked like dark hair. Another one was walking between the tents, heading toward where Dad was sleeping. I must have made some noise because suddenly Dad was outside his tent with a flashlight. He pointed it toward the figures, and one of them let out this scream that didn't sound human at all. Not like any animal I'd ever heard either. It was high-pitched but powerful, and it echoed off the mountainside. The one near the tents disappeared behind Dad's tent, and the ones by the creek vanished into the forest like ghosts. Dad stood there for a long time, flashlight scanning the trees. Then he walked over to our tent. "You boys okay?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Dad, what were those things?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "Probably just elk," Dad said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Go back to sleep. I'll keep watch for a bit." In the morning, we found footprints near the creek. They were barefoot but enormous, easily twice the size of Dad's boots. Dad just stared at them, then scuffed them out with his foot before we could look too closely. Later that day, a sheriff's deputy drove up to the camp. He told Dad they were extending the evacuation zone because of increased activity from the mountain. The deputy looked nervous, kept glancing at his watch, like he didn't want to be there any longer than necessary. "You really should pack up and head out today," he told Dad. "Scientists are saying pressure's building up, could blow any time." Dad nodded but said, "We'll head out in a couple days, just need to finish securing things here." After the deputy left, I asked Dad why we weren't leaving. He just ruffled my hair and said, "Don't worry about it, we'll be gone before anything happens." That night, Dad kept the fire burning bright and stayed up late, his rifle across his lap. I couldn't sleep. Every noise from the forest made me jump. The mountain was making more noises too, these weird hissing sounds and occasional rumbles. Our last evening there was when everything went crazy. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the camp. We were sitting around the fire pit while Dad cooked beans for dinner. Mark nudged me and pointed toward the tree line. At first, I didn't see anything. Then they emerged from the forest, a group of at least 6 of them, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call them. There was no mistaking what they were. They walked upright like humans, but were massive, covered in long, dark hair that hung from their arms almost to their knees. Some of them carried large sticks, like walking staffs. They stopped at the creek, kneeling down to drink. In the fading light, I could see their faces, not quite human, not quite ape, with deep-set eyes that reflected the sunset. They didn't seem aggressive. They felt purposeful, like they were going somewhere with a destination in mind. Dad slowly stood up, put his hand on his rifle, but didn't raise it. He motioned for us to stay still and quiet. The creatures finished drinking and then, to my absolute shock, walked straight through our campsite. They passed maybe 30 feet from where we were sitting, close enough that I could smell them. This weird, musky odor like wet dog mixed with something earthy. They never looked directly at us, but I felt like they knew we were there. They just kept walking, crossing through the camp and over a ridge in the distance. None of us moved until they were out of sight. "Dad?" Mark's voice was barely audible. "Were those—" Dad just nodded. "Finish your dinner. We're leaving first thing tomorrow." We stayed close to the fire that night. None of us slept much. We kept hearing footsteps through the camp. More of them passing through, I think. Dad kept the rifle ready, but never fired it. In the morning, we found tracks everywhere, probably 20 or 30 sets crossing right through our campsite. Dad didn't try to hide them this time. He just silently packed up our stuff, loaded some of the logging company's smaller equipment into the truck, and we left. We were barely down the mountain when Dad pulled over at a viewpoint. We sat there looking back at Mount St. Helens for a long time. "Boys," he finally said, "what we saw up there, there's no point telling people about it. Nobody would believe us anyway." The next day, May 18th, the mountain erupted. The entire area where we'd been camping was completely destroyed. The blast was so powerful, it flattened trees for miles, melted glaciers, and changed the shape of the mountain forever. Years later, I went back to the area with Mark. Nothing looks the same. The landscape is still recovering, even decades later. We've never camped on that mountain again. Can't bring ourselves to do it. Dad eventually told us that loggers had known about those creatures around Mount St. Helens for years. They'd find footprints, hear strange calls in the night, occasionally spot one at a distance. But there was an unspoken agreement. You don't talk about it and you don't bother them. I've thought a lot about why they were there that week. I think they knew what was coming. Animals can sense natural disasters before they happen. Dogs get anxious before earthquakes. Birds fly away before tsunamis. I think those Sasquatch were evacuating the mountain. They were leaving their home because they knew it was about to be destroyed. And by pure luck, we saw them go and followed them off the mountain just in time. I still think about those creatures sometimes. Where did they go? Did they all make it to safety? Are they still out there in the Cascades somewhere? I don't know. But I do know that what I saw was real. And sometimes when I'm hiking in remote areas, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see one of those massive figures watching me from the shadows. Story 11. I still get chills thinking about what happened to me this past April. I've been hesitant to share this because I know how it sounds, but I need to get this off my chest. I've always been a practical person. I work in construction, I hunt, I fish, I'm outdoors a lot. I'm not the type to make up stories or see things that aren't there. But what I saw that day on State Route 92 near Tonkanak, Pennsylvania, has completely changed how I see the world. It was a Wednesday afternoon, around 1 o'clock. I was driving my pickup after finishing up a job early, taking the scenic route home along SR 92. The weather was decent, overcast but dry, around 55 degrees. The trees were just starting to bud, and that marshy area past the Miller farm was greener than usual from all the spring rain we'd had. I remember I was just passing that big marshy section on the east side of the road. Locals know it. It's about 3 miles south of the Tonkanak Bridge, when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was maybe a bear. We get black bears around here all the time, but something about the way it was crouched in the reeds didn't look right. It was too big, and the color was off. Not black, but a light brownish color. I slowed down. There wasn't any other traffic, and pulled onto the shoulder. I rolled down my window to get a better look. That's when it happened. Whatever was crouching in those reeds suddenly stood up and kept standing up and up. My heart literally skipped a beat. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. This thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8. It was massive. Not just tall, but built like a linebacker on steroids. The shoulders on this thing were unbelievably wide, easily twice the width of a big man. It stood there for maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like time had stopped. It was facing away from me, looking toward the hillside. The thing that struck me most was its head. It wasn't round like a human head, but more like a coconut shape, coming to a slight point at the top. And there was almost no neck. Its head just sat on those enormous shoulders. The fur or hair covering it was mainly light brown, but with these darker brown patches on its back and shoulders. Not like spots, more like the way a deer's coat sometimes has different colored areas. Then it turned slightly, not fully facing me, but enough that I could see its profile. Its arms were ridiculously long, hanging down almost to its knees. They weren't thin either. They looked powerful, like tree trunks. I was frozen in my seat. I couldn't even reach for my phone to take a picture. Then, as if it suddenly realized it was being watched, it moved. And holy shit, the way it moved. This thing took off up the hill toward the tree line faster than any human could run. It wasn't lumbering or awkward. It was smooth, powerful. It pushed branches out of its way with those long arms as it went, not breaking stride at all. In seconds, it was gone, disappeared into the woods. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 15 seconds, but I sat there in my truck for a good 10 minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. My hands were shaking when I finally got out of the truck. I walked over to where it had been standing, but I was honestly scared to go too far into the marsh. The reeds were trampled down in a clear path leading from deeper in the marsh to where it had stood up. Some of the reeds were broken at about 5 feet high, like something big had pushed through them. I took some pictures of the area with my phone, but of course the creature was long gone. I walked along the edge of the marsh looking for tracks, but the ground was too grassy right there to show anything clear. I couldn't stop thinking about it all afternoon. I called my buddy James as soon as I got home. James and I have been friends since high school, and he's the only person I knew who wouldn't immediately think I was crazy or drunk. He's always been interested in cryptids and unexplained stuff, has all these books about Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and whatnot. "Dude, you're not going to believe what I just saw," I told him. "Try me," he said. When I described what I'd seen, there was silence on the other end for a few seconds. "We need to go back," he finally said. "Tonight." Part of me didn't want to go back at all, but another part needed to know if there was any evidence, anything to prove I hadn't hallucinated the whole thing. We met up around 7 that evening. The sun was still up but getting low. James brought a camera with a good zoom lens, some plaster of Paris in case we found footprints, and a couple of flashlights. I brought my hunting knife and a baseball bat. I don't own a gun, but I wanted something for protection. Looking back, a bat would have been useless against what we saw, but it made me feel better. We parked at the same spot where I'd pulled over earlier and walked to the marsh. The trampled area was still visible, so we followed it as best we could without going too deep into the muck. "Look at this," James said, pointing at a section of broken reeds. "Something big came through here." Then we spotted it, at the edge of the marsh, where the ground started to firm up before sloping uphill to the trees. A footprint, a single, unmistakable footprint pressed deep into the mud. I've been hunting since I was 12. I know what bear tracks look like. I know what every animal print in Pennsylvania looks like. This wasn't any of them. This was a foot, shaped vaguely like a human foot, but massive. It had to be at least 20 inches long, maybe more. The width was wider than my hand with my fingers spread, and the toes, 5 distinct toes, but they were spread apart, longer than human toes. James immediately started mixing the plaster to make a cast. "Holy shit, Mike," he kept saying. "Holy shit." While he worked on that, I noticed something on one of the broken reeds nearby. A hair, a single coarse hair about 6 inches long, light brown with a darker tip. It was stuck to the jagged end of a snapped reed, like it had been pulled out when whatever passed through had broken the plant. I carefully removed it and put it in a small plastic bag from my pocket. The hair was nothing like human hair. It was thicker, coarser, almost like horsehair, but not quite, and it was too long and the wrong color to be from any animal common to the area. Once James finished with the plaster cast, we decided to follow the direction the creature had gone, up toward the tree line. The sun was setting now, and I was getting nervous about being out there after dark, but I couldn't turn back. Not yet. "We should try a call," James suggested when we were about halfway up the hill. "A what?" I asked. "Bigfoot researchers use calls to try to get responses," he explained. Then before I could stop him, he cupped his hands around his mouth and let out this weird, howling whoop that echoed through the trees. We stood in silence for about 30 seconds. Nothing. He did it again, louder this time. That's when we heard it. A sharp crack from within the forest, like someone had struck a tree with a heavy stick. It came from our right, maybe 100 yards into the woods. "Wood knock," James whispered, his eyes wide. "That's a classic response." I was about to suggest we leave when another crack sounded, this time from farther to the left, then another from deeper in. It was like whatever was in there was circling us, communicating with these knocks. My skin was crawling. These weren't random sounds. They were responses. Something intelligent was answering James's call. We pressed on toward the tree line, moving slower now, both of us constantly looking around. That's when we found the structures. Just at the edge of the woods were branches and small logs, arranged in patterns that couldn't be natural. One was a teepee-like formation of sticks leaning against each other. Another was a row of branches laid parallel to each other on the ground, biggest to smallest, like some kind of primitive measuring tool. "They do this," James whispered. "They make these stick structures as territorial markers, or maybe communication with other Bigfoot." The sun was nearly gone now, and I'd had enough. "We need to go," I said. "Now." James nodded, looking disappointed but also scared. We hurried back down to the car, constantly looking over our shoulders. The woods seemed to be watching us the whole way. We got back to my truck just as true darkness fell. James was ecstatic about the plaster cast and the hair sample, but I felt unsettled, like we'd crossed some boundary we shouldn't have. I couldn't stop thinking about it all. About 2 weeks later, in early May, I went back. I don't know why, some compulsion I couldn't explain. This time I brought my mountain bike, thinking I'd cover more ground and have a faster escape if needed. I parked at the same spot and rode up a logging trail that ran parallel to where we'd been before. It was mid-morning, bright and clear. I felt safer in the daylight. I was about a mile up the trail when I heard it, a high-pitched screeching call from deep in the woods to my right. It wasn't a bird or any animal I recognized. It was almost like someone trying to imitate a bird call but getting it wrong. Too forceful, too deliberate. Then another answering from farther away. They went back and forth 3 times. I didn't stick around to investigate. I turned that bike around and pedaled faster than I ever have in my life. I still have the hair and the plaster cast. James wanted to send the hair to a lab for testing, but I've been hesitant. Part of me doesn't want to know. Part of me already knows. I drive that stretch of SR92 differently now. I don't stop. I don't slow down. I keep my eyes on the road, not on the marsh or the woods beyond. But sometimes in my rearview mirror, I catch myself looking at the tree line, wondering if something is watching me from just inside the forest edge. I haven't told many people about what happened. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw. I know that Pennsylvania's forests hide something most people don't believe exists. Something intelligent, something powerful, something that's been there long before us and will probably outlast us all. Sometimes at night, I wake up thinking I hear wood knocks in the distance, and I wonder if it's looking for me the way I was looking for it. Story 12. I still get goosebumps thinking about that weekend in Zaleski. I've spent the last 7 years trying to rationalize what happened, but I can't explain it away anymore. It was June of 2016, right after semester finals. My buddies and I had been planning this camping trip for months. Me, Jason, Drew, and Kyle. We all needed to decompress after a brutal year at Ohio State. We're all outdoorsy guys, grew up hunting and fishing, so when Drew suggested Zaleski State Forest, we were all in. Drew knew about this small 10-acre lake deep in the forest. It wasn't on any of the official campground maps, just a little hidden gem his dad had shown him years ago. The appeal was obvious. No tourists, no park rangers checking sites, just us and nature. We had to hike about 3 miles off the main trail to reach it, but it was worth it. We arrived Friday afternoon. The weather was perfect, mid-70s, light breeze, not too humid. The lake was gorgeous, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. You could really feel how remote it was. No cell service, no sounds of highways or civilization. Just birds, wind in the trees, and occasionally some rustling from small animals. We set up our tents about 30 feet from the water's edge, built a fire pit, and spent the evening fishing, drinking beers, and bullshitting like we hadn't seen each other in years. That first night was uneventful. We crashed around 2 a.m. after killing a 12-pack and roasting hot dogs. Typical guy stuff. Saturday was spent hiking, swimming, and exploring the area around the lake. We found some cool rock formations about half a mile east of our camp. The whole day, I kept getting this weird feeling that we were being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia from being so isolated. When you're used to city living, true wilderness can mess with your head a bit. That night is when everything changed. We'd had a few beers but weren't drunk, maybe slightly buzzed at most. It was important we stayed somewhat alert because, you know, we were in bear country. Around midnight, we were sitting around the fire talking about our plans after graduation. The fire was starting to die down, and the night had gotten quiet except for the occasional hoot of an owl. Then we heard it. At first, it sounded like something large moving through the underbrush behind our camp, maybe 50 yards into the tree line. Not careful movements either. This was crashing, breaking branches, displacing vegetation. My first thought was bear, and I immediately stood up, grabbing the flashlight from my camping chair's cup holder. "You guys hear that?" I whispered, pointing the beam toward the sound. Everyone froze. Kyle reached for the hatchet we'd used to split kindling. The crashing got louder, then suddenly stopped. We all stared into the darkness beyond the flashlight beam. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. Just dead silence. Then, something emerged from the darkness between 2 large oak trees. I still remember every detail with perfect clarity. It was small, maybe 4 feet tall at most, but it wasn't a child. The proportions were all wrong. It had an incredibly solid-looking chest and shoulders, muscular but compact. Its arms were short and thick, hanging slightly forward. The legs looked powerful, like a sprinter's. The whole body was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. Not patchy like a mangy animal, but uniform. In the limited light, I couldn't make out facial features clearly. Just a somewhat pointed head, dark eyes reflecting the flashlight, and no visible neck. The head seemed to sit directly on those powerful shoulders. We all saw it. I know because I heard Jason mutter, "What the fuck?" under his breath, and Drew was frantically fumbling with his phone trying to turn on the camera. Kyle had stood up beside me, hatchet in hand. The creature didn't acknowledge us at all. It moved with purpose, not running but walking quickly on 2 legs toward the lake. Its gait was odd, not quite human, almost like it was bouncing slightly with each step. When it reached the edge of the water, about 20 yards from our camp, it stopped. That's when it started making those sounds. I've spent years trying to find anything in nature that sounds similar. The closest I can describe is a combination of a young child crying and an elk bugling, but that's not quite right either. It was a high-pitched, wavering moan that would rise and fall in pitch. It sounded mournful somehow, like it was calling for something. It did this 3 or 4 times, each call lasting maybe 5 seconds with pauses in between. We were all frozen in place, watching, not daring to move or speak. After the 4th call, something answered from deep in the forest behind us. The response was nothing like the creature's call. This was a full-throated, powerful howl that seemed to vibrate through my chest. It wasn't a wolf or coyote. I've heard those plenty of times hunting with my dad. This was deeper, louder, more deliberate. It had an almost human quality to it, but no human could produce a sound with that much power. The moment that howl echoed across the lake, the small creature's behavior changed instantly. Its head snapped around toward the sound, and without hesitation, it took off running back toward the forest. The speed was incredible. It crossed the distance to the tree line in seconds, moving faster than any human could. The way it ran was strange too. Arms pumping, legs driving forward with obvious power, but with an efficiency of movement I've never seen in a person. Then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness. For several minutes, none of us spoke. The forest remained eerily silent. Finally, Drew broke the tension. "Did we all just see that?" he asked, his voice shaking. We started talking over each other, trying to process what we'd witnessed. Kyle wanted to pack up immediately and hike out, even though it was the middle of the night. Drew kept saying it must have been some kind of escaped exotic pet, or maybe a deformed bear cub. Jason was just pale and quiet. I remember feeling strangely calm despite my racing heart. I kept replaying the creature's movements in my mind. The way it walked upright, the proportions of its body, the incredible speed, none of it matched any animal I knew. "We should arm ourselves," I said finally. We gathered everything that could be used as a weapon. The hatchet, our largest knives, even heavy sticks from the firewood pile. We stoked the fire back to full strength, piling on extra wood to keep it blazing through the night. None of us slept. We sat in a circle around the fire, facing outward, listening to every snap and rustle in the forest. Occasionally, we'd hear distant crashing sounds, like something large moving through the underbrush, but nothing approached our camp again. As dawn broke, the forest gradually returned to normal. Birds started singing, squirrels chattered, and that sensation of being watched finally dissipated. When full daylight arrived, we decided to investigate. We approached the spot where the creature had stood at the lake's edge. The ground there was soft, and we could see where something had disturbed the grass and dirt. There were depressions that might have been footprints, but nothing clear enough to make out distinct shapes. Whatever it was had been there, though. The physical evidence confirmed we hadn't collectively hallucinated. We followed its path back to the tree line, but lost the trail in the leaf litter and undergrowth. Kyle suggested following the direction of the howl to see if we could find where the larger creature had been, but nobody was eager to venture that deep into the forest, not after what we'd seen. We packed up camp immediately after that and hiked out. The 3-mile trek back to our cars was tense. We kept close together, constantly scanning the woods around us. I had the overwhelming feeling that we were being followed, but at a distance, as if something was making sure we were leaving its territory. For years afterward, we barely talked about what happened. When we did, it was usually after a few drinks, and we'd downplay it or joke about it. "Remember that time we thought we saw Bigfoot?" someone would say. But our laughter always sounded forced. I started researching after that weekend. I spent countless hours on forums and websites dedicated to unexplained phenomena and cryptid sightings. Most of it was obviously fake or explainable, but occasionally I'd find accounts that matched details of what we saw. The proportions, the movement patterns, the vocalizations. The turning point came in 2019, when I watched a documentary that included audio recordings of supposed Bigfoot calls. The moment I heard the recording of what they called juvenile Sasquatch vocalizations, I felt sick to my stomach. The similarity to what we'd heard that night was undeniable. The documentary also discussed theories about Sasquatch family units and how juveniles might be trained or called back by adults when they wander too far. Exactly what seemed to happen at our campsite. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm still processing it myself. But I know what I saw wasn't a bear, wasn't a known animal, and certainly wasn't a person in a suit. The movement alone was impossible to fake. the raw speed and fluidity of it. Sometimes I think about going back, maybe with cameras or recording equipment. But then I remember the feeling I had hiking out that morning, that sense of being watched, being followed. And I remember that powerful howl that seemed to vibrate through my bones. Whatever called that juvenile back that night is still out there in those woods, and I think it knows we saw something we weren't supposed to see. Story 13. I've been going back and forth about whether to share this for months now. Part of me wants to forget it ever happened, but I can't stop thinking about it, especially at night when I'm trying to sleep. The doctors said talking about it might help, so here goes. Last March, my life was falling apart. My ex-husband's buddy Mark became my supervisor after a department reshuffling, and he immediately started making my life hell. This wasn't a coincidence. My ex had poisoned the well, telling Mark all kinds of twisted versions of our breakup. Suddenly, my workload doubled. Tasks that used to be spread among 3 people landed on my desk alone. Every mistake, no matter how small, ended up in my performance file. I was barely sleeping, constantly anxious, and one Thursday night I just broke down crying in my kitchen. I needed to get away, to breathe, to think, so I threw my camping gear in the car and called in sick for Friday. I decided to head out to Potholes Coulee in central Washington, about a 3-hour drive from my place. I've always loved the channeled scablands. There's something about that stark, rocky landscape that speaks to me. Not many people know about Dusty Lake Trail, and in March, I figured I'd have the place mostly to myself. The area is pretty primitive, just basalt cliffs, sagebrush, and these weird lakes filled by irrigation runoff. No facilities, no rangers checking in, just you and nature. I arrived Friday around noon. The parking area had only one other car. Perfect. I shouldered my pack and hit the trail, feeling the weight of the office drama fall away with each step. The trail winds down through this rocky corridor before opening up to reveal several lakes nestled between cliffs. I hiked for about an hour before finding a spot behind some large rocks where I could set up camp with a bit of privacy. After setting up my tent, I just sat on a rock and stared at the water. The wind was picking up, but I didn't care. For the first time in months, I could actually hear myself think, and what I was thinking was, I need to quit this job. The moment I formed that thought, I felt this bizarre wave of euphoria wash over me. It was almost physical, like someone had removed a crushing weight from my chest. I actually laughed out loud. I spent the rest of the day just wandering around, taking pictures of the strange rock formations, watching birds circle overhead. I didn't see anyone else, which was exactly what I wanted. By evening, the wind had really picked up. I secured everything, crawled into my tent, and fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night with my heart racing. I'm not sure what woke me, maybe a dream, but I felt absolutely terrified for no reason. My skin was covered in goosebumps despite the warm sleeping bag. I lay there trying to calm down, telling myself it was just anxiety from work following me out here. Then I heard it, a strange sound in the distance, kind of like a truck's jake brake, but not quite. It was too far away to make out clearly, and with the wind, I couldn't tell what direction it came from. I told myself it was probably just someone on the highway miles away. Eventually, I fell back asleep, but my dreams were full of being chased. The next morning was clear and cool. I made coffee on my little camp stove and tried to shake off the weird feelings from the night before. As I was sitting there, I thought I saw one of the large rocks about 50 yards away move just slightly, like it shifted position. I blinked, and whatever I thought I saw was gone, just another rock among hundreds. I chalked it up to tricks of the morning light and my tired eyes. After breakfast, I decided to hike up to one of the ridges to get a better view of the whole area. I brought my camera with the telephoto lens. I'd heard there were eagles out here, and I was hoping to get some good shots. The hike was more challenging than I expected. The terrain is basically a jumble of massive basalt blocks with scrubby vegetation growing in between. no marked trails once you leave the main path. I finally made it to a good vantage point around midday. The view was spectacular. You could see for miles across this alien landscape of coulees and lakes. I spotted some eagles circling near one of the distant cliffs and set up my camera to track them. That's when I saw it. Through my telephoto lens, I was scanning the ridge about half a mile away when this figure came into view. At first, my brain tried to make it a person, maybe another hiker, but no, this thing was enormous, 8, maybe 10 feet tall. It was walking along the ridge with these long, fluid strides. Its body was massive, covered in what looked like dark brown or black hair. I froze, my eye glued to the viewfinder, my finger automatically clicking the shutter. I watched as this thing moved along the ridge, then started to descend the cliff face. The cliff was nearly vertical. No human could have climbed down it without equipment, but this creature just went down it like it was nothing. Using handholds I couldn't even see from my position. I must have taken dozens of photos before it disappeared from view. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set the camera down. I sat there for several minutes trying to process what I'd just seen. There was no way that was a bear or a person in a suit. The way it moved was too fluid, too powerful. Part of me wanted to look at the photos right away, but a stronger part was screaming to get back to my campsite, pack up and get the hell out of there. I should have listened to that voice. God, I wish I had, but I didn't. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd probably seen a bear standing on its hind legs, that the distance and light had played tricks on me. I convinced myself to stay another night, partly because I didn't want to admit I was scared, and partly because I'd told everyone I was taking a weekend trip. Going home early would require explanations. So I headed back to camp, checking over my shoulder the whole way. When I got there, everything was as I'd left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The euphoria from yesterday was completely gone, replaced by a constant low-grade anxiety that had nothing to do with my job. I tried to distract myself by looking at the eagle photos, but I couldn't bring myself to look at the other ones. Not yet. I made an early dinner as the sun started to dip behind the cliffs. The shadows grew longer, darker. Every sound made me jump. Around dusk, small rocks started tumbling down the slope behind my tent. At first, just one or two, then more. I told myself it was just loose rocks being moved by the wind or small animals, but deep down, I knew better. When a baseball-sized rock landed right next to my cooking stove, I decided I'd had enough. I started packing up, throwing things haphazardly into my backpack, not caring about organization. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely roll up my sleeping bag. The sun had fully set by the time I got everything packed. I put on my headlamp and started hiking out. The trail seemed different in the dark, longer, more confusing. I kept hearing sounds behind me, footsteps that were too heavy to be human, branches breaking that were too thick to be broken by anything small. I was about halfway back to the parking area when I made the mistake of looking back. In the dim glow of my headlamp, I saw it, standing on the trail maybe 30 yards behind me. Massive, impossibly tall. Its eyes caught the light and reflected back like two yellow-green coins. I ran, stumbling over rocks, my backpack bouncing painfully against my spine. I could hear it behind me, not running but moving fast. Purposeful. I was gasping for breath, my lungs burning. Then something hit me in the back, hard enough to make me stumble. A rock. It had thrown a rock at me. Another one whizzed past my head. A third struck a boulder near me and shattered. I remember thinking, this thing is trying to kill me. When something struck the back of my head, the pain was immediate and blinding. I felt myself falling, but I don't remember hitting the ground. I woke up in the hospital 4 days later. According to the nurses, 2 hikers found me the next morning, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. My backpack was still on me, but my camera was gone. They assumed I'd fallen and hit my head on a rock. I had a severe concussion, a fractured skull, and had been in a coma. The doctors asked what happened, but I couldn't tell them the truth. Who would believe me? I said I didn't remember, that I must have fallen while hiking out in the dark. But I remember those yellow-green eyes. I remember the sound of those heavy footsteps. I remember the terror of realizing I was being hunted. I never went back for my camera. I never want to see those photos anyway. While I was in the hospital, Mark called to tell me I was fired for missing work without proper notification. I didn't even argue. It qualified me for unemployment while I recovered. I've moved since then. I'm in Leavenworth now, doing remote Medicare form submissions from my apartment. I haven't been hiking or camping since. I can't. Every time I think about going into the woods, I feel that same panic I felt that night. I have a scar on the back of my head where they had to put in 7 stitches. Sometimes I touch it just to remind myself it wasn't a dream or a hallucination. Something was out there. Something that didn't want me in its territory. I used to think Bigfoot was a gentle, shy creature that just wanted to be left alone. Now I know better. Some of them might be peaceful, but the one I encountered wasn't. It was territorial and aggressive, and it was intelligent enough to use weapons. I still have nightmares about those yellow-green eyes watching me from the darkness. I wake up hearing those heavy footsteps coming closer. And sometimes when the wind is strong, I think I hear that sound again. Not quite like a truck's jake brake, but something deeper, more primal. I don't know why it let me live. Maybe the hikers scared it off. Maybe it thought I was dead. All I know is that I'm never going back to that place again. And if you're smart, you won't either. Story 14. I still get chills thinking about what happened to me 3 years ago. I've always been an outdoorsy guy, spent most of my adult life working in remote locations across Alberta, and never had any issues with wildlife or being alone. That changed in June of 2019. I was contracted as a surveyor for a pipeline project west of Rainbow Lake, Alberta. For those who don't know the area, it's extremely remote. We're talking about the northwestern corner of Alberta, surrounded by dense forest and wetlands. My job was pretty straightforward. Walk old seismic lines, basically straight cuts through the forest that were made decades ago for exploration, mark GPS points, and collect data. The company had set up a small trailer camp as our base of operations. Usually we worked in pairs or small teams, but due to scheduling issues, I ended up alone at the camp for what was supposed to be a 6-day stint before my relief arrived. No big deal, I thought. I'd done solo work before. The trailer they gave me was nothing fancy, just a small unit with a bed, a kitchenette, a tiny bathroom, and enough space for my gear. It sat in a small clearing at the end of an access road, with the closest neighbor being another work camp about 20 kilometers away. The whole setup was temporary, sitting on leveling jacks rather than a proper foundation. The first 3 days went fine. I'd wake up early, make coffee, pack my lunch, and head out on my quad to survey my assigned sections. The work was tedious but peaceful. I'd return in the evening, make dinner, maybe read a bit, or watch something I'd downloaded on my tablet, then crash. No cell service out there, just a satellite phone for emergencies. It was on the 4th night that things started to feel off. I woke up around 3 in the morning with this weird sensation that something was circling the trailer. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, but more intense. I listened for a while but didn't hear anything unusual, just the normal forest sounds. Eventually I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next day was uneventful, but I found myself rushing to get back to the trailer before sunset. I'm not usually like that. I've spent countless nights in the wilderness and never felt uncomfortable before. That night, I double-checked the locks on the door and windows before turning in. Around 2 in the morning, I jerked awake to the sound of footsteps outside. Not the quick patter of a small animal, but slow, deliberate steps that crunched in the gravel around the trailer. I froze, listening as whatever it was walked slowly around the perimeter. The footsteps stopped right outside my window, then 3 soft taps on the wall. Tap, tap, tap. I can't explain why, but every instinct in my body told me not to look outside, not to make a sound, not to even move. I just lay there, barely breathing, as whatever was outside continued its circuit around the trailer. It paused at each corner, then continued until I heard the footsteps fade into the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept my rifle close, standard practice in bear country, and waited for dawn, telling myself it was probably just a curious moose or elk. When the first light came, I cautiously stepped outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Around the entire trailer were footprints, large, broad footprints pressed deep into the soft earth. They weren't bear tracks. I know what those look like. These were different. They had 5 toes. They were massive, at least 16 inches long, and they were clearly bipedal, walking in a consistent stride that no 4-legged animal could manage. I counted 10 to 12 distinct steps forming a complete circle around my trailer unit. Whatever made them was heavy enough to sink several inches into ground that was fairly firm. I'm not ashamed to admit I panicked a bit. I called my supervisor on the sat phone and requested that someone be sent up early. I didn't mention the footprints. I just said I was having equipment issues and could use help. He told me that the earliest anyone could get there would be Monday morning, after the weekend. I was on my own for 2 more nights. That day, I didn't venture far from the trailer. I did the minimum work required in the immediate area and stayed close to my quad and rifle. The whole time, I felt watched. You know how the forest usually has this background noise of birds and small creatures? Well, everything was silent that day, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I considered just packing up and leaving, but the company had strict policies about abandoning equipment, and honestly, I needed the money. So I decided to tough it out one more night. That was a mistake. I didn't even try to sleep that night. I sat up with my rifle across my lap, lights on, watching the door and windows. Around 1 in the morning, I started to drift off despite my best efforts. That's when it happened. There was a tremendous crash against the side of the trailer that jolted me fully awake. The whole structure rocked on its jacks. Before I could even process what was happening, another impact hit the opposite wall, then another. It sounded like something massive was slamming into the trailer with its entire body. Then came the pounding. Heavy thuds like fists hammering against the metal siding, not random, but rhythmic, deliberate. Between the impacts, I could hear breathing, deep, wet breathing, like something with lungs bigger than mine. I scrambled to the floor, rifle ready, trying to stay below window level. The trailer walls are thin, basically just metal siding over a frame, and they were flexing inward with each impact. Then I heard it, the sound of claws or nails scraping down the side from roof to ground, slow, deliberate. The screech of metal being scored made my teeth hurt. The whole trailer suddenly shifted sideways, the floor tilting beneath me. Whatever was out there was pushing against the trailer, rocking it on its jacks. I heard one of the stabilizers snap with a sharp crack, and the trailer listed further. I was in full panic mode now, debating whether to fire a warning shot or just stay silent. Before I could decide, the pushing stopped. There was a moment of complete silence, then heavy footsteps moving away toward the cut line. Just before the footsteps faded completely, I heard it. A sound I'll never forget, a grunt so deep I felt it more than heard it. It wasn't like any animal sound I've ever heard, and I've heard plenty of bears, wolves, and moose in my time. This was different, almost like a human grunt, but deeper, more resonant. It vibrated in my chest. Then silence fell. I didn't move from my spot on the floor until first light started to filter through the windows. My legs were cramped, and I was drenched in sweat despite the cool night. As soon as I could see clearly outside, I packed my essential belongings, started up my quad, and rode the 20 kilometers back to the highway access point. I didn't even bother securing the trailer properly. My relief was scheduled to arrive at noon. I waited at the highway junction, jumping at every sound from the forest. When he finally showed up, I must have looked like hell, because his first question was, "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to explain what had happened, and he laughed it off at first. "Probably just a bear," he said. "They get curious sometimes." I convinced him to drive back to the trailer with me so I could collect the rest of my gear. His laughter died in his throat when we got there. One entire side of the trailer was dented inward. The metal rippled like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. The stabilizing jack on that side was completely broken. But what really shut him up were the handprints. Muddy impressions on the back window with 5 distinct fingers, each one larger than a dinner plate. We towed that trailer out of there that same afternoon. I declined to finish my contract despite the financial hit. My supervisor wasn't happy, but when I showed him the photos of the damage, he stopped pushing. I've spent my career in the wilderness. I'm comfortable with bears, wolves, and all manner of wildlife, but I will never spend another night alone in a trailer in those woods. I know what was out there. I know what was circling my trailer, what was testing my walls, what left those massive footprints. It was a Sasquatch. Call it Bigfoot, call it whatever you want. I never believed in them before that night. Now I can't stop believing. I still work as a surveyor, but I refuse remote solo assignments now. Some co-workers think I'm being dramatic. That's fine. They weren't there. They didn't hear that breathing, that grunt that seemed to come from something ancient. They didn't see those handprints that made human hands look like a child's in comparison. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear those 3 gentle taps on my bedroom wall. Tap, tap, tap. And I wonder if it followed me home. Story 15. I've been camping practically my whole life, but nothing prepared me for what happened last September in Kisatchie National Forest. I've spent the last 6 months trying to make sense of it, but I still can't. I'm not a superstitious person or someone who jumps at shadows. I've always been the rational one in my friend group, the guy who debunks ghost stories around the campfire. But what I experienced that weekend has shaken everything I thought I knew. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just me and Duke, my lab mix, who's been my camping buddy since he was a pup. Duke's normally fearless, always ready to chase squirrels or investigate any sound in the woods. We'd been to Kisatchie before, but never to this particular area. I'd heard about a secluded spot from another hiker, off the main trails where you could really feel alone with nature. I arrived Friday afternoon around 3, with plenty of time to set up camp before dark. The spot was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, with enough space for my tent and a fire pit. I remember thinking how quiet it was, almost unnaturally so. No distant highway sounds, no other campers, just the occasional bird call and the wind through the trees. That first night was uneventful. Duke and I ate dinner, I had a couple beers, and we turned in early. I slept like a rock, which isn't always easy in the woods. But something about the isolation was peaceful. Saturday was spent hiking the nearby trails. We covered about 8 miles, Duke running ahead and doubling back like he always does. Everything was normal. We saw some deer, a couple of woodpeckers, even a fox darting through the underbrush. Duke barked at it but didn't give chase. We got back to camp around 4 in the afternoon, and I started gathering wood for that night's fire. This is where things started to feel off. As dusk approached, I noticed Duke acting strangely. He kept looking toward the tree line, ears perked up, body tense. I figured it was probably a raccoon or maybe that fox again. But when I called him over, he came immediately and stayed right by my side, which isn't like him at all. Duke's curious by nature. He investigates everything. I got the fire going around 7. The temperature had dropped and the warmth felt good. Duke was still acting weird, staying close to me instead of sprawling out by the fire like he usually does. Around 8:30, I heated up some chili for dinner. I remember checking my watch because I was thinking about how early the forest gets dark in September. That's when Duke did something I'd never seen before. He suddenly stood up, hackles raised, and stared intensely at a spot in the woods beyond our campsite. Then he tucked his tail between his legs and bolted for the tent. Not just walking away, I mean he ran, like something was chasing him. He crawled inside and wouldn't come out, not even when I called him or offered food. I sat there, feeling uneasy, but telling myself it was nothing. Maybe he'd caught a scent of something, a bear or coyote. But deep down, I knew Duke wouldn't react that way to normal forest animals. He's encountered them before without issue. It was about 9:15 when I first heard it. Movement in the woods. Not the light rustling of small animals, but heavy, deliberate steps. Something big was moving out there, circling the perimeter of my campsite just beyond where the firelight reached. I could hear branches breaking under substantial weight. The unmistakable sound of something large pushing through the underbrush. My first thought was bear. Had to be. But it didn't move like any bear I've encountered. Bears aren't subtle. They crash through the forest. This was more controlled, almost methodical, and there was something else, a smell like wet dog combined with something musky and rotten. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on and pointing it toward the sounds. Nothing, just trees and darkness. But the movement continued, now from a different direction. Whatever it was circling my camp. I started talking out loud, something they tell you to do to scare off bears. "Hey there, just me camping here." My voice sounded thin and pathetic against the vastness of the forest. The movement stopped for a moment, and I felt a surge of relief. Then I heard it again. Not from one direction, but three. Different locations, all around me, multiple creatures, all moving in concert. That's when I saw the first one. It stepped partially into the edge of the firelight about 30 yards away. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over me by at least 2 feet. Massive shoulders, broader than any human's, covered in dark, coarse hair. Its arms hung unnaturally long, nearly reaching its knees. But it was the face that froze my blood. Not quite human, not quite animal. Its eyes caught the firelight and reflected it back in a way no human eyes should, glowing like some kind of predator. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My brain kept trying to categorize what I was seeing. Bear standing on hind legs, some guy in a suit, but I knew it wasn't either of those things. This was something else entirely. Then I saw the second one, emerging from my right. This one was even taller, bulkier, with a jutting jaw and what looked like yellowed teeth visible even from that distance. Its face had patches of leathery gray skin visible through the hair. It made a sound, not quite a growl, deeper than that, more like a rumble you feel in your chest than something you hear. I think I was in shock. Part of my brain was screaming at me to run, but another part knew that would be suicide. These things could outrun me in seconds. My tent, with Duke still inside, was about 15 feet behind me. My truck was parked about 200 yards away on a dirt access road. I had nowhere to go. The third one appeared from behind me, forcing me to turn my head. I could hear it before I saw it. A lighter brown color than the others, with matted hair that hung in clumps. This one seemed more agitated, moving back and forth at the edge of the light. Suddenly, it slapped a nearby pine tree with an open hand. The sound was like a shotgun blast in the quiet forest, and I felt the impact in my chest. The tree, which had to be at least 10 inches in diameter, visibly shook. It was a display of strength that made my situation crystal clear. If they wanted to hurt me, there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. What happened next is hard to explain. They started moving in a coordinated way, circling my campsite, but staying just at the edge of visibility. I'd see one, then it would fade back into the darkness, only for another to appear elsewhere. They never fully entered the campsite, never approached the fire directly. It was like they were assessing me, or maybe establishing some kind of boundary. I didn't dare move from my spot by the fire. My back was burning from sitting so close to the flames, but the heat was the only comfort I had. I kept the fire burning as hot as I could, feeding it with any wood I could reach without standing up. Duke was still in the tent, utterly silent. No barking, no growling, just silence. That scared me almost as much as the creatures. Duke is protective. He should have been going crazy, but it was like he knew better than to draw attention to himself. I don't know how long this standoff lasted. It felt like hours, but realistically was probably 20 or 30 minutes. Time stretches when you're terrified. They communicated with each other, not with words, but with these low, chest-rumbling vocalizations. Sometimes one would make a sound, and another would answer from across the clearing. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they started to withdraw. The first one stepped back into the darkness, then the second. The third, the agitated one, stayed the longest, staring at me with an intelligence that was unmistakable. Then it too melted back into the forest, but they didn't leave. I could still hear them moving around the perimeter of my camp, still circling, still watching. This continued for at least another hour. Occasionally I'd catch glimpses, a shadow moving between trees, the crack of a branch, those eyes reflecting my firelight back at me. Around midnight, the sounds began to fade, moving further away until I couldn't hear them anymore. But I didn't dare leave my spot by the fire. I kept it burning all night, adding wood whenever it started to die down. I didn't sleep. Couldn't sleep. Just sat there, back aching, eyes burning from smoke and exhaustion, jumping at every sound from the forest. When the first grey light of dawn finally appeared, I felt a relief so profound I nearly cried. I waited until I could see clearly, then called Duke out of the tent. He emerged cautiously, still on edge, staying close to me as I packed up camp in record time. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. I just wanted out. As I was loading the last of my gear into my truck, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. All around the perimeter of my campsite, maybe 40 yards out in every direction, were footprints. Not human footprints. These were massive, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They formed a perfect circle around where I'd been camped. I took pictures, but they came out blurry and indistinct in the early morning light. I was shaking too badly to hold my phone steady. I haven't been back to Kisatchie since then. Haven't been camping anywhere, actually. Duke still gets nervous when we're outside after dark, even in my fenced backyard. I've spent months researching, trying to make sense of what I saw. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call them. I was never a believer before, used to laugh at those grainy photos and shaky videos. Now I understand why the evidence is always so poor. When you're face to face with something like that, the last thing on your mind is documenting it properly. What haunts me most isn't the fear I felt that night. It's the intelligence I saw in their eyes. They weren't mindless animals. They coordinated, communicated, made decisions. They could have easily harmed me but chose not to. They were establishing territory, sending a message. This is our place. You don't belong here, and they were right. I don't. Story 16. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or things that go bump in the night. My brother Jake and our buddy Mike are the same way. Just regular guys who love hunting and the outdoors. But what happened to us in the mountains near McCall, Idaho back in May of 2015 changed everything. I thought I knew about what's real and what isn't. We'd been planning this turkey hunting trip for months. Jake and I had gone the year before and had decent luck, so we invited Mike along this time. The three of us packed up my old Ford F-150 and made the drive up from Boise on a Friday afternoon. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold, just a beautiful early May weekend. We reached the campground around 4 in the afternoon. But we didn't want to stay there with all the other weekend warriors. We wanted to get deep into the backcountry where the hunting would be better. So we shouldered our packs, grabbed our shotguns, and started hiking up this trail that eventually led to a high ridge. It was tough going with all our gear, but after about 3 miles, we found this perfect flat spot just off the trail to set up camp. By the time we got our tent up and gathered some firewood, the sun was starting to set. We cooked some beans and hot dogs over the fire, had a couple beers, and talked about where we'd start hunting in the morning. Nothing unusual at all, Just three guys enjoying being away from civilization for a while. We turned in around 10 that night. I remember checking my watch before I zipped up my sleeping bag. Mike fell asleep almost immediately. The guy can sleep through anything. Jake and I chatted quietly for a bit before dozing off. Everything was perfectly normal, until it wasn't. I jolted awake to the sound of Jake saying, "What the hell was that?" It took me a second to get oriented. The tent was pitch black. I fumbled for my phone to check the time. It was just after midnight. "What's going on?" I whispered. "Listen," Jake said, and then I heard it. A howl, but not like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a wolf, not a coyote, not an elk. This was long and drawn out, lasting nearly 10 seconds without breaking. It rose and fell in pitch, echoing through the mountains. It came from somewhere down the slope from our campsite, maybe a quarter-mile away. "That's different," I said, trying to sound casual even though my heart was suddenly racing. "Never heard anything like that before," Jake replied. We listened for a while, but didn't hear it again. After about 20 minutes, I started to drift back to sleep, telling myself it was probably just some weird echo effect, making a normal animal sound strange. I woke up again around 2 in the morning. This time, all three of us were awake. Mike was sitting up in his sleeping bag, and Jake had his hand on his shotgun. "You guys hear that?" Mike whispered, and I did. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling our tent. Whatever it was big. Each step was slow and purposeful, like it was trying to be quiet, but was too heavy to manage it completely. The ground seemed to vibrate slightly with each step. "I'm grabbing the shotgun," Jake said in a normal speaking voice. The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. We all held our breath, straining to hear anything. Then there was a deep grunt, like something exhaling forcefully. It was so close. Couldn't have been more than a few feet from the tent wall. Then something pushed against the side of the tent, not violently, but deliberately. The nylon wall bowed inward, like something was pressing a hand or paw against it, feeling what it was. I remember staring at that indentation, my whole body frozen. After a few seconds, the pressure disappeared, and we heard the footsteps again, this time moving away from us, back into the forest. None of us slept the rest of the night. We kept the shotguns close and took turns keeping watch until dawn. When the first light finally came, we checked around the campsite, but didn't find any clear tracks, just some disturbed pine needles and dirt. We spent the morning debating what to do. Mike wanted to pack up and head back to the car, but Jake and I had been planning this trip for too long to bail after one weird night. We convinced ourselves it was probably just a curious bear, though deep down I knew bears don't make that kind of howling sound. We decided to compromise. We'd move our camp about half a mile uphill to a more open area where we'd have better visibility. We spent the day hunting, though none of us went very far from each other, and we didn't have much luck. I think we were all too distracted, constantly scanning the trees around us. That evening, we set up the new camp and built a bigger fire than the night before. We stayed up later, talking about anything except what had happened, but eventually we had to sleep. This time, we arranged our sleeping bags so we were all facing different directions, with our shotguns within reach. Despite my anxiety, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up suddenly to Jake shaking my shoulder. My watch said midnight, exactly midnight, just like the night before. "Listen," he whispered. The howl came again, the exact same sound as the night before, but this time it seemed closer. It still came from downhill, which meant whatever it was had followed us to our new campsite. The sound made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't natural either. It was almost mournful. "What the hell makes that noise?" Mike whispered. None of us had an answer. We stayed awake, listening. Just like the night before, about 2 hours after the howl, we heard the footsteps. The same heavy, deliberate steps circling our tent. I could tell by the timing between steps that whatever it was had a long stride, much longer than a human's. Jake had his shotgun across his lap. Mike was clutching his hunting knife. I had my flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, though I knew we had no service out here. The footsteps stopped, just like they had the night before when Jake spoke. We waited in silence, then came the grunt, that deep, chest-rumbling exhale. Something pressed against the tent wall again. This time, it seemed to be moving its hand, paw, appendage, slowly up and down, like it was feeling the texture of the nylon. The indentation moved across the wall of the tent, getting closer to the entrance flap. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was just the need to know what the hell was out there. But I suddenly decided I had to see it. My hand was shaking as I reached for the zipper of the tent flap. Jake grabbed my arm, shaking his head frantically, but I pulled away. I unzipped the flap just enough to create a small opening, maybe 3 inches wide. I clicked on my flashlight and angled the beam through the gap. What I saw will stay with me until the day I die. Standing just 4 feet from our tent was a creature I can only describe as massive. Its head nearly reached the lower branches of the pine trees, had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark brown hair, thick and matted in places, with some lighter strands mixed in. The hair wasn't like a bear's fur. It was longer, more like human hair but much coarser, but it was the face that turned my blood to ice. The face had no hair, just grayish rough skin that looked like worn leather. Its nose was broad and flat, nostrils flaring slightly as it breathed. The eyes were deep-set and dark, so dark I couldn't distinguish pupils from irises. They reflected my flashlight beam for just a split second before the creature turned its head slightly away from the light. Its shoulders were enormous, impossibly wide, and its arms hung down longer than a human's would, with massive hands that ended in what looked like blunt, dark fingernails. It stood upright, on 2 legs, with a slight hunch to its posture. It was looking directly at the tent, directly at me. I don't know how long I stared at it. Probably only a few seconds, but it felt like hours. Then my brain finally caught up with what my eyes were seeing, and pure terror took over. I dropped the flashlight, zipped the tent flap closed with fumbling fingers, and scrambled back to my sleeping bag. "What the fuck was that?" Jake whispered, his voice higher than I'd ever heard it. I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone completely dry. Mike was frozen, staring at me with wide eyes. We heard the heavy footsteps again, this time moving away from the tent and back into the trees. The 3 of us sat in silence, clutching our weapons, listening as the footsteps faded into the distance. None of us spoke for what seemed like hours. Eventually, Mike broke the silence. "What did you see, David?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I tried to describe it, but words failed me. How do you describe something that shouldn't exist? Something your brain tells you can't be real, even when it's standing right in front of you. "We're leaving at first light," Jake said. Nobody argued. As soon as we could see well enough to pack up, we did. We didn't cook breakfast. We didn't talk. We just stuffed everything into our packs as quickly as possible and started hiking back down to the campground. We didn't stop once during that 3-mile hike. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that massive figure following us through the trees. It's been years since that trip, and I've never gone back to those mountains. None of us have. We've talked about it a few times, usually after a few too many beers, but mostly we avoid the subject. Jake refuses to go turkey hunting at all anymore. Mike moved to Arizona last year, said he needed somewhere with fewer trees. I still go camping occasionally, but never alone and never in dense forest. I stick to open areas now, places where I can see what's coming. I've spent countless hours researching what we might have encountered. I've read about bears, about mountain lions, about all the known wildlife in Idaho. Nothing matches what I saw that night. The only thing that comes close are the stories about Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I was never a believer in that stuff before. I used to laugh at those blurry photos and ridiculous TV shows. I don't laugh anymore, because whatever was circling our tent that night, whatever made that haunting howl at midnight, whatever pressed its hand against our tent wall, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever seen or heard of. It was something Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. Some experiences change how you view the world forever. I still wake up sometimes at exactly midnight, my heart pounding, convinced I can hear that long, drawn-out howl in the distance. And in those moments, I'm right back in that tent in the Idaho wilderness, realizing that we humans might not be alone in the deep, dark woods after all. Story 17. I never thought I'd be sharing this. I've been holding on to this experience for so long, turning it over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Even now my hands are shaking as I type this. It happened last September 12th to be exact. We live just outside Klamath, California, in a house that backs up to dense forest. My son Tyler, who was 8 at the time, was playing with his buddy Jake, a 12-year-old from down the road. They're always out catching bugs and looking for snakes and doing all the stuff boys do when they don't have screens in front of their faces. That afternoon, they were out near the edge of our property. I was inside fixing a leaky faucet when they came bursting through the back door. I've never seen my son look like that before. His face was ghost white and he was struggling to catch his breath. Jake wasn't much better. Both boys looked like they'd seen a ghost. "Dad! Dad!" Tyler was practically hyperventilating. We saw him. We saw the big, hairy man in the woods. Now, I need to say right off the bat that I'm not some gullible believer. I've always been the practical type. I fix things with my hands for a living, and I deal with what I can see and touch. So my first thought was that the boys had spooked themselves over a bear, or maybe even a homeless person camping out there. "Slow down, buddy," I told him, putting my hands on his shoulders. "Take a breath and tell me what you saw." Both boys started talking at once, but I managed to get the story out of them. They'd been poking around the creek bed looking for garter snakes when they heard branches breaking. Tyler said there was this awful smell, like rotted chicken was how he described it. When they looked up, about 100 feet away, standing between 2 redwoods, was what they described as a massive hairy man. "It was covered in dark brown hair, Dad," Tyler insisted, "all over, and it was shaking a branch in its hand like it was angry at us." Jake nodded frantically. "It was huge, Mr. Owens, way bigger than you, like way bigger." They said they froze and stared at it for maybe 5 seconds before their survival instincts kicked in and they bolted home. I'll admit, my first instinct was to brush it off. Kids have active imaginations, right? But the terror in their eyes, that was real. I've never seen my son so genuinely frightened. "Did it chase you?" I asked. They both shook their heads. Tyler said, "We didn't look back, we just ran." To calm them down, I told them I'd go check it out. I figured I'd find nothing, or maybe some evidence of a bear, and that would be that. I grabbed my rifle, just a precaution, and headed out to where they said they'd seen this hairy man. The spot they described was about a 1/4 mile from our property line, in a shaded area where the creek bends around a cluster of old-growth trees. As I approached, I noticed an unusual silence. Normally, these woods are alive with bird calls and the rustle of small animals, but that afternoon, everything was dead quiet. I'm not sure what I expected to find, nothing probably, but what I discovered sent a chill straight down my spine. There, in the soft mud by the creek bank, were footprints. Not bear prints, not human prints either. These were different. Massive. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, but who would trudge all the way out here to leave fake footprints where hardly anyone ever goes? I knelt down to examine them closer. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made them was heavy. As I was studying the tracks, I heard movement, something big moving through the brush up the steep hillside to my right. The undergrowth was so thick I couldn't see what it was, but whatever was pushing through those bushes had to be substantial. My heart started hammering in my chest. I'm not ashamed to admit I got out of there pretty quick. Not running like the boys, but definitely moving with purpose. The whole way back, I felt like something was watching me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those prints. I decided I needed to document this properly. So the next morning, I went back with a camera and some plaster of Paris I had in the garage from a school project Tyler did last year. In the daylight, the prints were even more impressive. I carefully made a cast of the clearest one. When it dried and I measured it, the dimensions were mind-boggling. 16.5 inches long, 8.5 inches wide at the toes, narrowing to 5 inches at the heel. For comparison, I wear a size 11 boot, and this thing made my footprint look like a child's. I counted 34 distinct prints, with an average stride of about 56 inches. That's nearly 5 feet between steps. I'm 6'1", and if I try to stretch my stride that far, I have to jump. Word travels fast in a small community. By the end of the day, a guy named Scott Harriet, who was up from Los Angeles, had heard about the footprints and wanted to see them. He's one of those Bigfoot enthusiasts who travels around investigating sightings. Normally, I'd roll my eyes at someone like that, but after what I'd seen, I was grateful for anyone who wouldn't immediately think I was crazy. We went back to the site together, and Scott was practically buzzing with excitement when he saw the tracks. He noticed something I'd missed. Several strands of coarse brown hair caught on a low-hanging branch. We carefully collected them in a Ziploc bag. "This is significant, Darryl," he told me, examining the hairs. "These aren't from any common animal in these parts." That night, something new happened. Around 9:30, we heard it. A scream unlike anything I've ever heard before. It started low, almost like a moan, then rose to a pitch that made the windows vibrate. It seemed to be coming from across the canyon. Tyler came running into our bedroom, terrified. "Dad, it's the hairy man." My wife pulled him into bed with us, trying to convince him it was just a mountain lion. But I knew better. I've heard mountain lions. This was something else entirely. The screams continued almost every night after that, always between 9 and 10. Sometimes there would be calls and responses, suggesting there was more than one of these things out there. The pattern was always the same, a long, wailing cry from the west side of the canyon, followed by a response from the east. I called a researcher named John Green, who's written books on this subject. He suggested that the severe drought we'd been experiencing might have driven these creatures westward toward the cooler coastline. It made sense. A lot of wildlife had been behaving unusually that year due to the lack of water. About a week after the boys' encounter, I saw it myself. I was splitting firewood near dusk when I had the feeling of being watched. I turned toward the tree line, and there it was, partially hidden behind a large fir, but visible enough that I could make out its features. The face is what I remember most clearly. Deep-set eyes under a heavy brow ridge, large nostrils, close together. The skin on its face was a dark, burnt orange color, like old leather that's been in the sun too long. Long, flowing hair cascaded from its head down its shoulders. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. I was frozen in place, the axe hanging uselessly at my side. Then it simply turned and melted into the forest with barely a sound, which is remarkable considering its size. I'd estimate it stood at least 8 feet tall. When Scott came back in October, we decided to try and capture video evidence. We both brought camcorders and set up near where I'd seen the creature. Just after sunset, we noticed movement in the heavy underbrush about 70 yards away. Through the viewfinder, I could see something with eyes that glowed red in the failing light, not reflecting our flashlights, but actually glowing, like the voltage was turned up and then down, as Scott described it. Unfortunately, the footage came out too dark and grainy to make out anything definitive. Just those eerie, glowing eyes appearing and disappearing in the darkness. The screams continued nightly until early November, when they suddenly stopped. Maybe the creatures moved on, or maybe they just became more cautious about making noise. Either way, we haven't heard them since. Tyler still won't go into the woods alone. Sometimes he wakes up with nightmares, saying he can smell the rotted chicken smell in his room. Jake's parents ended up moving away. They said it was for his dad's job, but I always wondered if those screams night after night had something to do with their decision. I still have the plaster cast and the hair samples. Scott sent the hairs to a lab, but they came back inconclusive, not matching any known species, but not definitively proving anything either. The cast sits on my workbench, a daily reminder that there are things in these woods that science hasn't explained. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just sharing what happened to my family. Before that September day, I would have laughed if someone told me a story like this. Now, I keep my rifle closer, I don't split wood after sunset, and I never, ever ignore it when the woods go quiet. Something is out there in the forests around Klamath. Something that walks on two legs but isn't human. Something that screams in the night and watches from the shadows. I don't know what to call it, but Bigfoot is as good a name as any. All I know for certain is that my son saw something that day by the creek, and whatever it was, it's still out there.